With the coming of the warriors and a manorial economy, a new social disposition arose, the warrior code of might. But mere coercion alone could not have created the relatively stable society, largely feudal in structure and values, that is described for us in such detail by the Homeric poets. Rather, it was the ethos of coercion, the mystification of courage, physical prowess, and a healthy lust for combat and adventure. It was not might as such, but the belief in the status, indeed the manner that might conferred on the individual, that led to an ideology of coercion, which the victor and his victim mutually acknowledged and celebrated. Accordingly, fortune itself, a derivative of the goddess of the chance Tyche, Greek, or Fortuna, Latin, acquired the form of a metaphysical principle. Very few expressions, possibly incantations, are older than the casting of the die and the fortunes of war. Tyche and Fortuna now emerged as the distinct correlates of Bronze Age warrior athleticism. These Bronze Age societies were clearly class societies, and wealth in the form of booty garnered by raids abroad and surpluses at home figured profoundly in their notions of fortune. The world of Agamemnon and Achilles and Odysseus was one of petty kings and nobles, observes M. I. Finley. Quote, who possessed the best land and considerable flocks, and lived in seigneurial existence, in which raids and local wars were frequent. End quote. Power and social activity centered around the noble's household, which was in fact a fortress. Power in this society, quote, depended upon wealth, personal prowess, connections by marriage and alliance, and retainers. End quote. Wealth was indeed a crucial factor. Its accumulation and acquisition determined the capacity of a noble to acquire retainers, who were often little less than mercenaries, to acquire arms and to wage war. Marriage was less an instrument of clan alliances than of dynastic power. The Homeric noble acquired land and wealth, not merely kinsmen, with a favourable match. In fact, the alliances he established were marked by a great deal of treachery and faithlessness, features that were characteristic of a political society rather than a tribal one. Tribal society was clearly waning. Quote, there is no role assigned to tribes or other large kinship groups. In the 20 years Odysseus was away from Ithaca, the nobles, suitors of Penelope, Odysseus's wife, behaved scandalously toward his family and his possessions. Yet his son Telemachus had no body of kinsmen to whom to turn for help, nor was the community fully integrated. Telemachus's claims as Odysseus's heir were acknowledged in principle, but he lacked the material and physical power to enforce them. The assassination of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra and her paramour Aegisthus placed an obligation of vengeance on his son Orestes, but otherwise life in Mycenae went on unchanged, except that Aegisthus ruled in Agamemnon's place. End quote. Apparently, These dynastic quarrels, assassinations and usurpations were not of special concern to the masses, who lived an unchronicled inner life in their obscure communities. They simply went about their own business, working their own parcels of land, or the best land, explicitly owned by the nobles. They herded the nobles' considerable flocks. As a class apart, theirs was also an interest apart. Nowhere in the Homeric narratives do they seem to have intervened in the conflicts of the heroes. So considerably weakened were the powers of the democratic tribal institutions, and so extensively had kinship ties been replaced by territorial ties and class relationships, that when Telemachus pleaded his case against the suitors to the assembly of Ithaca, the assembly, quote, took no action, which is what the assembly always did in the two Homeric poems, end quote. Homer's nobles, to be sure, still lived by an aristocratic code of honor, including table fellowship, gift exchange, sacrifice to the gods, and appropriate burial rites. But this aristocratic code and its obvious roots in early society were now continually violated by greed, acquisitiveness, and egotism. The nobles of the Odyssey were an exploitative class, not only materially but psychologically, not only objectively but subjectively. The analysis of Odysseus, developed by Horkheimer and Adorno, as the nascent bourgeois man, is unerring in its ruthless clarity and dialectical insight. Artifice, trickery, cunning, deception, debasement in the pursuit of gain, all marked the new discipline, so-called, that the emerging rulers imposed on themselves to discipline and rule their anonymous underlings. To be called a merchant was a grave insult to Odysseus, Finley observes. Quote, men of his class exchanged goods ceremoniously, or they took it by plunder. End quote. Thus was the primordial code of behavior honored formally. But valor became the excuse for plunder, which turned into the aristocratic mode of trade. Honor had in fact acquired its commodity equivalent. Preceding the prosaic merchant with goods and gold in hand was the colourful hero with shield and sword. Indeed, the commodity continued to make its pedestrian way against all codes. In Homeric times there is seafaring and a vital concern for trade, more exactly for the import of copper, iron, gold and silver, fine cloths and other luxuries, notes Finley. Quote, even chieftains are permitted to go on expeditions for such purposes, but generally trade and merchandising seem to be the business of foreigners. Unquote. Thus his status adorned, affirmed, and his appetite for accoutrements and luxuries, the material substance of privilege, satisfied by the statusless. Here we witness a radically new social dispensation, when chieftains, however few in number, are prepared to intermingle with foreigners, indeed pedestrian traders, and truck with them. Even the warrior code is in the balance. Might as right can no longer enjoy its high prestige in society's distribution of goods. A new ethos had to emerge if the integrity of trade and the security of traders was to be preserved and port cities were to become viable commercial centers. Piracy and looting could only be episodic. Their rewards were indeed the mere bounty and spoils of war. And the nobles of Bronze Age Greece were by no means ossified creatures of custom and tradition. Like their peers in England millennia later, as the enclosure movements of the 15th century onward were to show, they were governed by naked self-interest and by an increasing desire for the better things of life. The new code that was now to supplant valor and coercion also had a very old pedigree, notably in a reciprocity that had become standardized and lost its accidental form, to use Marx's terminology, as a mode of exchange. Indeed, one that was built on a clear and codifiable notion of equivalence. The notion of equivalence is distinguished from usufruct, the irreducible minimum, and the equality of unequals was not without its cosmic grandeur, in the literal sense of the formal, quantifiable, even geometric order. Tyche and Fortuna are too irascible to support the spirit of calculation, foresight, and rationality required by systematic commerce. Chance is in the lap of the gods, and in Homeric Greece, these deities were hardly the most stable and predictable of cosmic agents. Until capitalism completed its hold on social life, merchants were the pariahs of society. Their insecurities were the most conspicuous neuroses of antiquity and the medieval world. Hence their need for power was not merely a lust, but a compelling necessity. Despised by all, disdained even by the ancient lowly, they had to find firm and stable coordinates by which to fix their destinies in a precarious world. Whether as chieftain or as statusless trader, he who would venture on the stormy waves of commerce needed more than Tyche or Fortuna by which to navigate. The new code that edged its way into those preceding it picked up the principle of an exact, quantifiable equivalence from advanced forms of reciprocity, but without absorbing the sense of service and solidarity. Might was brought to the support of fair dealings and contract, not merely to violent acquisition and plunder. The cosmic nature of equivalence could be validated by the most dramatic features of life. Heaven and hell hang together, declare Horkheimer and Adorno, and not merely in the commerce of the Olympian gods with the chthonic deities, of good with evil, of salvation with disaster, of subject with object. Indeed, equivalence is as ancient as the very notions of heaven and hell, and is to have its own involuted dialectic as the submission of Dike for Tyche, Justitia for Fortuna. In the heroic age that celebrated Odysseus's long journey from Troy to Ithaca, men still traced equivalence back to its natural origins. Quote, just as the Gemini, the constellation for Castor and Pollux, and all other symbols of duality refer to the inevitable cycle of nature, which itself has its ancient sign in the symbol of the egg from which they came, so the balance held by Zeus, which symbolizes the justice of the entire patriarchal world, refers back to mere nature. The step from chaos to civilization, in which natural conditions exert their power, no longer directly but through the medium of human consciousness, has not changed the principle of equivalence. Indeed, men paid for this very step by worshipping what they were once enthralled to, only in the same way as all other creatures. Before, the fetishes were subject to the law of equivalence. Now, equivalence has itself become a fetish. The blindfold over Justitia's eyes does not only mean that there should be no assault upon justice, but that justice does not result in freedom." End quote. Justitia, in fact, presides over a new ideological dispensation of equality. Not only is she blindfolded, she also holds a scale by which to measure exchange fairly, equal, and exact. Guilt and innocence are juridical surrogates for the equitable allotment of things that appear in the marketplace. Indeed, all scales can ever do is to reduce qualitative differences to quantitative ones. Accordingly, everyone must be equal before Justitia. Her blindfold prevents her from drawing any distinctions between her supplicants. But persons are very different indeed, as the primordial equality of unequals had recognized. Justitia's rule of equality, of equivalence, thus completely reverses the old principle, inasmuch as all are theoretically equal in her unseeing eyes, although often grossly unequal in fact. She turns the equality of unequals into the inequality of equals. The ancient words are all there, but like the many changes in emphasis that place the imprint of domination on traditional values and sensibilities, they undergo a seemingly minor shift. Accordingly, the rule of equivalence, as symbolized by the scales in Justitia's hand, calls for balance, not compensation. The blindfold prevents her from making any changes of measure due to differences among her supplicants. Her specious equality, so-called, thus yields a very real inequality. To be right is to be just or straight, and both in turn negate equality on its own terms. Her just or straight judgment yields a very unbalanced and crooked disposition that will remain concealed to much of humanity for thousands of years, even as the oppressed invoke her name as their guardian and guide. Rarely has it been possible to distinguish the cry for justice with its inequality of equals from the cry for freedom with its equality of unequals. Every ideal of emancipation has been tainted by this confusion, which still lives in the literature of the oppressed. Usufruct has been confused with public property, direct democracy with representative democracy, individual competence with populist elites, the irreducible minimum with equal opportunity. The demand of the oppressed with equality acquires, as Engels puts it, a double meaning. In one instance, it is the spontaneous reaction against the social inequalities, against the contrast of rich and poor, surfeit and starvation. As such, it is the expression of the revolutionary instinct and finds its justification in that, and only in that." Unquote. In the other instance, the demand for equality becomes a reaction against justice as the rule of equivalence, which Engels sees simply as the bourgeois demand for equality. And, quote, "In this case, it stands and falls with bourgeois equality itself." End quote. Engels goes on to emphasize that the demand for the oppressed for equality, the proletarian demand for equality, is, quote, "the demand for the abolition of classes," unquote. But more than the abolition of classes is involved in freedom. In more general terms, the proletarian demand for equality is the demand for the injustice of an egalitarian society. It rejects the rule of equivalence for the irreducible minimum, the equalization by compensation of inescapable inequalities, in short, the equality of unequals. This demand has been repeatedly thrown out of focus, often for centuries at a time, by stormy battles for justice, for the rule of equivalence. The realm of justice, however, also prepares the ground for freedom by removing the archaisms that linger on from the folk world of equality. Primordial freedom, with its rule of the irreducible minimum, and its equality of unequals, was strikingly parochial. Aside from its lavish code of hospitality, organic society made no real provisions for the rights of the stranger, the outsider, who was not linked by marriage or ritual to the kin group. The larger world, beyond the perimeter of the people, was inorganic, to use Marx's appropriate term. Loyalties extended in varying degrees of obligation to those who shared the common blood oath of the community, and to the allies united by material systems of gift reciprocity. The notion of a humanity in which all human beings are considered united by a common genesis was still largely alien. Primordial peoples may be inquisitive, shy, or cordial towards strangers, or they may kill them for the most whimsical reasons. But they owe the stranger no obligation and are bound by no code that requires respect or security for the unpredictable new being that is in their midst. Hence, the unpredictability of their own behavior. Even Hellenic society, despite its high claims to rationality, did not advance to a point where the resident alien enjoyed authentic social, much less political, rights beyond the security and protection the polis owed to everyone who lived within its precincts. For much of the ancient world, this dubious status of the stranger was a distinctly widespread condition, despite the crucial services such aliens performed for the community and its citizens. Breaking the barriers raised by primordial and archaic parochialism was the work of Justitia and the rule of equivalence. And far from constituting an authentic break, the changes came very slowly, nor were these changes the work of abstract theorists or the fruits of an intellectual awakening. The agents for the new juridical disposition in the rights of city dwellers were the strangers who often serviced the city without craft or commercial skills. They were helped by the oppressed generally, who could hope to escape the whimsies and insults of arbitrary rule only by inscribing their rights and duties in an inviolable, codified form. Justitia, Dika, or whatever name she acquires in the civilizations of antiquity, is in large part the goddess of the social and ethnic outsider. Her rule of equivalence honors the plea for equity, which must be clearly defined in a written legal code if her scale and sword can redress the inequities that the outsider and the oppressed suffer under arbitrary rule. Thus, Justitia must be armed not only with a sword, but with the legal tablets that unequivocally define rights and duties, security and safety, rewards and punishments. The earliest of these legal tablets, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, 1790 BC, still contains distinct class biases and the instrumentalities of class oppression. Like the Mosaic lex talionis, the rule of equivalence is enforced with all the fury of class vengeance. The price for social infractions is paid with eyes, ears, limbs, and tongues, not to speak of life itself. But the code does not try to conceal the unequal class nature of this vengeance. Nobles get the better of commoners, men of women, and free men of slaves. Here, the appropriation of primordial society's equality of unequals, however perverted its form, still claims its penalty. But the code also weights privilege with a greater burden of social responsibility. Although the nobles of Hammurabi's time possessed a great many prerequisites of rank, as Howard Becker and Harry Elmer Barnes tells us, quote, including the right to exact heavily disproportionate retaliation for personal injuries, they could also be more severely punished for their offences and, guilty or not, had higher fees to pay. Unquote. The later codes were to free themselves from most of these inequitable archaisms. From the 8th century BC onward, we can observe in Hebrew Palestine and in Greece a steady unfolding of the dialectic of justice. The slow transformation of organic societies' equality of unequals into class societies' inequality of equals. The Mosaic lex talionis was fully established as the law of the land, despite such token concessions to the poor in the Deuteronomic Code as mortgage restrictions. The release every 7th year of Hebrew bondsmen from debt slavery, and the hallowing of the 50th year as a jubilee, in which everyone reacquires their possessions. Like the injunction in Leviticus that every debt slave be treated as a hired servant and a sojourner, these gestures were largely symbolic. Debt slavery alone, with its humiliating status of craven service, violated the very soul of the ancient desert democracy, the Bedouin Compact, around which the Hebrew tribes were united during their invasion of Canaan. That it could have entered into the juridical life of the community at all was a cruel acknowledgement of the compact's dissolution. In Athens, the reforms initiated by Solon opened the way to juridical equality based on political equality, or what has been called Hellenic democracy. Justice now openly functioned as a rule of equivalence, the rule of commodity equivalence, which produced new classes and inequities in personal power and wealth, even as it guarded the demos, the people of Athenian ancestry, from the exercise of arbitrary social power. Yet, within the framework of a society, presumably governed by law instead of persons, it was only the demos that had complete custody of the political system. Pericles' funeral oration may mark a secular and rational ascent in the direction of recognizing the existence of a humanitas, but it provides us with no reason to believe that the barbarian world, and by definition the outsider, were on a par with the Hellene, and juridically the ancestral Athenian. In fact, Athenian alien residents not only lacked the right to participate in assemblies like the ecclesia and the bull, or in the jury system, they had no explicit juridical rights of their own beyond the security of their property and lives. As we know, they could buy no land in the polis. Even more strikingly, they had no direct recourse to the judicial system. their cases could only be pleaded by citizens in the Athenian courts. That their rights were thoroughly respected by the polis may speak well for its ethical standards, but it also attests to the exclusivity of the ruling elite whose intentions, rather than laws, were the guarantors of the aliens' rights. Aristotle, an alien resident of Athens, does not equivocate on the superiority of the Hellenes over all other peoples. In citing the failure of the highly spirited barbarians of the north to organize into polis that could rule their neighbors, he reveals the extent to which he, together with Plato, identified the polis with social domination. Moreover, he rooted the capacity of the Hellenes to form polis, to be free, and to be capable of ruling all mankind, in their ethnic origins and their existence as the Hellenic genos. Blood, as well as geography, confers the capacity to rule. Aristotle sees the Hellenes as diversified, such that, quote, some have a one-sided nature, and others are happily blended, unquote, in spiritedness and intelligence. But to him, the ability to form polis, to rule, is a natural quality that allows for no social qualifications. The formal disappearance of the blood group into a universal humanitas that sees a common genesis for every free individual was not to receive juridical recognition until late in antiquity, when the emperor Caracalla conferred citizenship on the entire non-slave male population of the Roman Empire. It may well be that the Caracalla was as eager to enlarge the tax base of the empire as he was to prop up its sagging sense of commonality. But the act was historically unprecedented. For the first time in humanity's evolution, from animality to society, an immense population of highly disparate strangers, ranging throughout the Mediterranean basin, were brought together under a common political rubric and granted equal access to laws that had once been the privilege of only a small ethnic group of Latins. Juridically at least, the empire had dissolved the exclusivity of the folk, the kin group that had already devolved from tribal egalitarianism into an aristocratic fraternity of birth. According to the strictures of late Roman law, genealogy was dissolved into meritocracy, and the blood relationship into a territorial one, thereby vastly enlarging the horizons of the human political community. Caracalla's edict on citizenship was reinforced by a growing, centuries-long evolution of Roman law away from traditional patriarchal absolutism and the legal subordination of married women to their husbands. In theory, at least, the notion of the equality of persons was very much in the air during late imperial times. By the 3rd century AD, Roman natural law, that combined body of jurisprudence variously called the ius naturale and the ius gentium, acknowledged that men were equal in nature even if they fell short of this condition in society. The departure this idea represented from Aristotle's concept of mankind was nothing less than monumental. Even slavery, so basic to Roman economic life, had been placed at odds with the Hellenic notion of the slave's inborn inferiority. To Roman jurists of the imperial period, servitude now derived not from the natural inferiority of the slave, but, as Henry Maine has observed, quote, from a supposed agreement from victor and vanquished, in which the first stipulated for the perpetual services of his foe, and the other gained in consideration the life which he had legitimately forfeited." Unquote. Chattel slavery, in effect, was increasingly viewed as contractual slavery. Although Roman society never ceased to view the slave as more than a talking instrument, its legal machinery for dealing with slaves was to belie this degradation by the restrictions imposed in late imperial times on the appallingly inhuman practices of the Republican period. The notion of a universal humanity would probably not have remained more than a political strategy for fiscal and ideological ends, were it not for the emergence of a new credo of individuality. The word humanity is a barren abstraction if it is not given existential reality by self-assertive personalities who enjoy a visible degree of autonomy. Such beings could hardly be created by an imperial edict. To the extent that organic society declined, so too did the intense sense of collectivity it had fostered. A new context had to be created for the individual that would render it functional in an increasingly atomized world. Not that classical antiquity or the medieval world ever produced random, isolated, socially starved monads who people modern capitalist society. But the waning of primordial society placed a high premium on a new type of individual, a resourceful, comparatively self-sufficient and self-reliant ego that could readily adapt itself to, if not command, a society that was losing its human scale and developing more complex political institutions and commercial ties than any human community had known in the past. Such individuals had always existed on the margins of the early collective. They were ordinarily given a certain degree of institutional expression, if only to provide a safety valve for marked personal idiosyncrasies. Tribal society has always made allowances for aberrant sexual behavior, exotic psychological traits, and personal ambition, the big man syndrome. Allowances that find expression in a high degree of sexual freedom, shamanistic roles, and an exaltation of courage and skill. From this marginal area, society recruited its priests and warrior chieftains for commanding positions in later, more hierarchical institutions. But this development is not simply one of breakdown and recomposition. It occurs on a personal level and a social level, egocentric and sociocentric. Viewed on the personal level, the individual accompanies the emergence of civilization like a brash, unruly child whose cries literally pierce the air of history and panic the more composed, tradition-bound collectivity after the decline of organic society. The ego's presence is stridently announced by the warrior, whose own ego boundaries are established by transgressing the boundaries of all traditional societies. The Sumerian hero Gilgamesh, for example, befriends the stranger Enkidu, who shares his various feats as a companion, not a kinsman. Valor, rather than lineage, marks their myth-beclouded personal traits. But misty, almost stereotyped figures like Gilgamesh seem like metaphors for individuality rather than the real thing. More clearly etched personalities like Achilles, Agamemnon, and the Homeric warriors are often cited as the best candidates for Western conceptions of the newly born ego. The model of the emerging individual is the Greek hero, observes Max Horkheimer in his fascinating discussion of the rise and decline of individuality. Quote, daring and self-reliant, he triumphs in the struggle for survival and emancipates himself from the tradition as well as from the tribe. Unquote. That these qualities of daring and self-reliance were to be prized in the Greco-Roman world is accurate enough, but it is doubtful if the model is properly placed. In fact, the most striking egos of the archaic world were not the Bronze Age heroes celebrated by Homer, but the Iron Age anti-heroes, so cynically described by the Archilochus. Indeed, Archilochus himself was the embodiment of this highly unique personality. He links a hidden tradition of the ego's self-assertion in organic society with the calculating individual of emerging civilization, so-called. Unlike a quasi-mythical despot like Gilgamesh, or a newly arrived aristocrat like Achilles, Archilochus speaks for a remarkable breed, the displaced, wandering band of mercenaries who must live by their wits and cunning. He is no Homeric hero, but rather something of an armed bohemian of the 7th century BC. His self-possession and libertarian spirit stand in marked contrast to the disciplined lifeways that are congealing around the manorial society of his day. His very existence almost seems improbable, even an affront to the heroic posture of his era. His occupation as the itinerant soldier reflects the sweeping decomposition of society. His arrogant disdain for tradition exudes the negativity of the menacing rebel. What cares he for the shield he has abandoned in battle? Quote, myself I saved from death. Why should I worry about my shield? Let it be gone. I shall buy another equally good. Unquote. Such sentiments could never have been expressed by a Homeric hero with his aristocratic code of arms and honor. Nor does Archilochus judge his commanders by their mien and status. He dislikes a, quote, tall general striding forth on his long legs, who prides himself on his locks and shaves his chin like a fop. Let him be a small man. Unquote. Let him be a small man, he declares. Perhaps even bow-legged, as long as he stands firm on his feet, full of heart. Unquote. Archilochus and his wandering band of companions are the earliest record we have of that long line of masterless men who surface repeatedly during periods of social decomposition and unrest. Men and later women who have no roots in any community or tradition, who colonize the world's future rather than its past. Their characters are literally structured to defy custom, to satirize and shatter established mores, to play the game of life by their own rules. Marginal as they may be, they are the harbingers of the intensely individuated rebel who is destined to turn the world upside down. They have broad shoulders, not puny neuroses, and express themselves in a wild, expletive-riddled poetry or oratory. Society must henceforth always warily step aside when they appear on the horizon and silently pray that they will pass by unnoticed by its restive commoners. or else it must simply destroy them. But these are the few sharply etched personalities of history, the handful of marginal rebels whose significance varies with the stability of social life. Their fortunes depend upon the reception they receive by much larger, often inert masses of people. On another, more broadly based level of history, the notion of individuality begins to percolate into these seemingly inert masses, so-called, and their personalities are emancipated, not by Archilochus and his type, but by society itself, which has a need for autonomous egos who are free to undertake the varied functions of citizenship. The development of the individual on this social level, in short, is not an isolated, idiosyncratic personal phenomenon. It is a change in the temper, outlook, and destiny of millions who are to people civilization for centuries to come and initiate the history of the modern ego up to the present day. Just as the contemporary proletariat was first formed by severing a traditional peasantry from an archaic manorial economy, so the relatively free citizen of the classical city-state, the medieval commune, and the modern nation-state was initially formed by severing the young male from an archaic body of kinship relationships. Like the blood oath, the patriarchal family constituted a highly cohesive moral obstacle to political authority, not because it opposed authority as such, as was the case with organic society, but rather because it formed the nexus for the authority of the father. Ironically, patriarchy represented, in its kinship claims, the most warped traits of organic society in an already distorted and changing social world. Here, to put it simply, gerontocracy is writ large. It answers not to the needs of the organic society's principle of sharing and solidarity, but to the needs of the oldest among the elders. No system of age hierarchy has a more overbearing content, a more repressive mode of operation. In the earliest forms of the patriarchal family, as we have seen, the patriarch was answerable to no one for the rule he exercised over the members of his family. He was the incarnation, perhaps the historical source, of arbitrary power of domination that could be sanctioned by no principle, moral or ethical, other than tradition and the ideological tricks provided by the shaman. Like Yahweh, he was a primal I in a community based on the we. To a certain extent, this implosion of individuation into a single being, almost archetypal in nature, is a portent of widespread individuality and egotism, but in a form so warped that it was to become the quasi-magical personification of will before a multitude of individual wills were to appear. Justice slowly transformed the patriarch status, first by turning the feared father into the righteous father, just as it transformed Yahweh from a domineering, jealous God into a just God. Patriarchy, in effect, ceased to be mere arbitrary authority. It became juridical authority that was answerable to certain precepts of right and wrong. by turning the crude warrior morality of might is right into the rule of equivalence and the lex talionis of equity, justice produced a transition from mere arbitrary coercion to coercion that must be justified. Coercion now had to be explained, according to concepts of equity and inequity, right and wrong. Justice, in effect, provided to transition from arbitrary and even supernatural power to juridical power. From a tyrant, the patriarch became a judge and relied on guilt, not merely fear, to assert his authority. This transformation of the patriarch's status occurred as a result of genuine tensions in the objective world. The elaboration of hierarchy, the development of incipient classes, and the early appearance of the city and state combined the social forces to invade the family and stake out a secular claim on the role of the patriarch in the socialization and destiny of the young. Organized religions, too, staked out their own claim. Women were largely excluded from this process of secularization and politicization. They remained the chattels of the male community. But the young men were increasingly called upon to take on social responsibilities as soldiers, citizens, bureaucrats, craftsmen, food cultivators. In short, a host of duties that could no longer be restricted by familial forms. As society shifted still further from kinship to territorial forms, from broadly hierarchical to specifically class and political forms, the nature of patriarchy continued to change. Although patriarchy retained many of its coercive and juridical traits, it became increasingly a mode of rational authority. Young men were granted their birthright as citizens. No longer were they merely sons. The father was obliged to guide his family according to the ways of reason. He was not simply the just father, but also the wise father. In varying degrees, conditions now emerged for devaluing the patriarchal clan family and for its substitution by the patricentric nuclear family. The realm of a highly privatized, monogamous relationship between two parents and their offspring. Under the aegis of justice, the state acquired increasing control over the highly insulated domestic world, initially by dissolving the internal forces that held the patriarchal family together with its own juridical claims. The dissolution of the all-encompassing patriarchal I into fairly sovereign individuals with ego boundaries of their own gained greater impetus with the expansion of the polis into the cosmopolis, with the small, self-enclosed city-state into the large, open world city of the Hellenistic era. With the growing role of the stranger as craftsman, trader, and seafaring merchant, the notion of the demos, united by blood and ethical ties, into a supreme collective entity, gave way to the claims of the individual. Now, not merely citizenship, but the private interests of the wayfaring ego, partly shaped by the problems of economic interest, became the goals of individuality. The cosmopolis is a tremendous commercial emporium, and for its time, a merchant's playground. We can closely trace the individual's fortunes from the kinship group and the enclave of the patriarch into the city-state, particularly the Athenian polis, where individuality assumes richly articulated civic qualities and a vibrant commitment to political competence. From the brother or sister of organic society, the individual is transformed into the citizen of political society, notably the small civic fraternity. But as the civic fraternity expands in scope beyond a humanly comprehensible scale, the ego does not disappear. It acquires highly privatized, often neurotic traits that center around the problems of a new inwardness. It retreats into the depths of subjectivity and self-preoccupation. The cosmopolis does not offer the social rewards of the polis, a highly charged civicism, an emphasis on the ethical union of competent citizens, or firm bonds of solidarity or philia. Nor does it offer a new sense of community. Hence, the ego must fall back on itself, almost cannibalistically, as we shall see in our own era, to find a sense of meaning in the universe. Epicurus, the privatized philosopher of retreat par excellence, offers it a garden in which to cultivate its thoughts and tastes, with a wall, to be sure, to block it off from the bustle of a social world it can no longer control. Indeed, the state itself takes its revenge on the very insolent creature it helps to create, the world citizen, who is now helpless under the overbearing power of a centralized imperial apparatus and its bureaucratic minions. Nevertheless, the ego requires more than a place, however well cultivated, in which to find its bearings. Divested of its niche in the polis, it must find a new niche in the cosmopolis, or, as many cosmopolis literally suggests, in the cosmos. Humanitas now becomes a cosmos, a new principle for ordering experience. And the city-state, like the folk world before it, becomes an object of ideological derision. Initially, this derisive outlook takes the form of the politically quietistic philosophy of Stoicism that the educated classes embrace in late antiquity. The Stoics, whose ideas were to nourish the Christian clergy for centuries to come, brought the fruits of justice, the individuated ego, and the ideal of universal citizenship into convergence with each other during the age of the cosmopolis and empire. Epictetus, whose writings appeared during one of the most stable periods of the imperial age, radically clears the ground for this new, rather modern type of ego. From the outset, he harshly derides the polis's sense of exclusivity as atavistic. Quote, "Plainly, you call yourself Athenian or Corinthian, after that more sovereign realm, which includes not only the very spot where you were born, but also that region from which the race of your forebears has come down to you." Unquote. But this is patently absurd, he declares, and shallow. Quote, "When a man has learned to understand the government of the universe, and has realized that there is nothing so great or sovereign or all-inclusive as this frame of things wherein men and God are united, and that, from it, comes the seeds from which are sprung not only my father or grandfather, but all things that are begotten and that grow upon the earth, and rational creatures in particular, for these alone are by nature fitted to share in the society of God, being connected by him by the bond of reason. Why should he not call himself a citizen of the universe and a son of God?" End quote. In its universality and sweep, this statement, voiced nearly 2,000 years ago, matches the most fervent internationalism of our own era. But here, Epictetus was formulating not a program for institutional change, but rather an ethical stance. Politically, the Stoics were utterly quietistic. Freedom, to Epictetus, consists exclusively of internal serenity, of a moral insulation from the real world, one that is so all-inclusive that it can reject every material need and social entanglement, including life itself. By the very nature of a freedom, carried to such quietistic lengths, it is impossible for any being, quote, to be disturbed or hindered by anything but itself. It is a man's own judgment which disturbs him. For when the tyrant says to man, "I will chain your leg," he that values his leg says, "Nay, have mercy." But he that values his will says, "If it seems more profitable to you, chain it." End quote. In his own way, Max Stirner, the so-called individualistic anarchist of the early 19th century, was to turn this Stoic notion of the utterly self-contained ego on its feet and infuse it with a militancy, indeed an arrogance, that would appall the Stoics. But in principle, both Epictetus and Stirner created a utopistic vision of individuality that marked a new point of departure for the affirmation of personality in an increasingly impersonal world. Had this doctrine of worldly disenchantment and personal withdrawal drifted off into history with the empire that nourished it, later periods might have seen it merely as the passionless voice of a dying era, like the exotic cults and world-weary poems that intoned the end of antiquity. But Christianity was to rework Stoicism's quietistic doctrine of personal will into a new sensibility of heightened subjectivity and personal involvement, inadvertently opening new directions for social change. It is easy and largely accurate to say that the Church has been a prop for the state. Certainly, Paul's interpretation of Jesus' message to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's leaves the troubled world unblemished by any political and social challenges. Early Christianity had no quarrel with slavery, if we interpret Paul's injunctions correctly. Yet, when Paul persuades Onesimus, the runaway Christian slave, to return to his Christian master, Onesimus is described as that dear and faithful brother who is also a fellow citizen of yours. For slave, master, and Paul are themselves slaves to a higher master in heaven. Citizen and slave here are used interchangeably. Accordingly, Christianity entered into a deep involvement with the fortunes of the individual slave. Between Christian priest and human chattel, there was a confessional bond that was literally sanctified by a personal deity and by the intimate relationship of a sacred congregation. This existential quality reflects a feature of Christianity that has survived every epoch since its appearance. Universal citizenship is meaningless in the absence of real, unique, concrete citizens. The concept that humanity is a flock under a single shepherd attests to the equality of all persons under a single loving God. They are equal not because they share a political recognition of their commonality, but rather a spiritual recognition by their Father. In Jesus, social rank and hierarchy dissolve before the leveling power of faith and love. On this spiritual terrain, worldly masters can be less than their slaves in the eyes of God, the wealthiest less than the poorest, and the greatest of kings less than their lowliest subjects. An all-pervasive egalitarianism liberates the subject from all ranks, hierarchies, and classes that are defined by social norms. Not merely citizenship, but the principle of equality of all individuals and the absolute value of every soul unites the citizens of the heavenly city into a holy brotherhood. The worldly implications of this message are stated far more compellingly in the exegetical literature of Augustine than in the holy writ of Paul. Like Epictetus and Paul, Augustine completely dissolves the genos into a heavenly city that invites humanity as a whole to become its citizens. No folk ideology can admit this kind of conceptual framework into its outlook of the world. By contrast, the heavenly city for Augustine, its early voice is the universal church, melds all diversity among peoples. Quote, all citizens from all nations and tongues into a single pilgrim band. She takes no issue with that diversity of customs, laws, and traditions, whereby human peace is sought and maintained. Instead of nullifying or tearing down, she preserves and appropriates whatever in the diversity of diverse races is aimed at one and the same objective of human peace, provided only that they do not stand in the way of faith and worship of the one supreme and true God. End quote. Lest this be dismissed merely as Stoic and Pauline quietism, or worse, clerical opportunism that renders the church infinitely adaptable, Augustine adds that the, quote, heavenly city, so long as it is wayfaring on earth, not only makes use of earthly peace, but fosters and actively pursues, along with other human beings, a common platform in regard to all that concerns our pure human life, and does not interfere with faith and worship. End quote. The Church does not merely render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. It replaces his claims to Dominus by a clerical dominion and his claims to Deus by a heavenly deity. Quote, this peace the pilgrim city already possesses by faith, and it lives holily and according to this faith, as long as, to attain his heavenly competition, it refers every good act done for God or for his fellow man. I say fellow man because, of course, any community life must emphasize social relationships. End quote. Augustine's ambiguities are more explosive and implicitly more radical than his certainties. Latent in these remarks is the potential quarrel of church and state that erupts with Pope Gregory VII and the investiture crisis of the 11th century. The ecumenicalism of the remarks opens the way to outrageous compromises, not only with the paganism and its overt naturalistic proclivities, but to anarchic tendencies that demand the rights of the individual and the immediate establishment of a heavenly city on earth. The peace of the pilgrim city would be reduced to a chimera by unceasing heresies, including demands for a return to the communistic precepts and egalitarianism of the apostolic Christian congregation. Finally, Augustine's historicism admits not only for the indefinite postponement of Christ's return to earth, so similar to the unfulfilled promise of communism in the Marxian legacy, but also for the eventual certainty of Christ's return to right the ills of the world in a distant millennial era. Owing to his ambiguities, Augustine created immense problems that beleaguered Western Christianity for centuries and enriched the Western conception of the individual with not only a new sense of identity, but also a new sense of enchantment. The secularization of the individual and the disenchantment of personality that came with Machiavelli's emphasis on the amorality of political life, and Locke's notion of the proprietary individual, divested of the self and humanity of their utopian content. Tragically, both were reduced to objects of political and economic manipulation. Christianity had made the self a wayfaring soul, resplendent with the promise of creative faith and infused with the spell of a great ethical adventure. Bourgeois notions of selfhood were now to make it a mean-spirited, egoistic, and neurotic thing, riddled by cunning and insecurity. The new gospel of secular individuality conceived the self in the form Homo economicus, a wriggling and struggling monad, literally possessed by egotism and an amoral commitment to survival. From the 16th century onward, Western thought cast the relationship between the ego and the external world, notably nature, in largely oppositional terms. Progress was identified not with spiritual redemption, but with the technical capacity of humanity to bend nature to the service of the marketplace. Human destiny was conceived not as the realization of its intellectual and spiritual potentialities, but as the mastery of natural forces and the redemption of society from a demonic natural world. The outlook of organic society toward nature and treasure was completely reversed. It was nature that now became demonic and treasure that now became fecund. The subjugation of human by human, which the Greeks had fatalistically accepted as the basis for a cultivated leisure class, was now celebrated as a common human enterprise to bring nature under human control. This fascinating reworking of Christian eschatology from a spiritual project into an economic one is fundamental to an understanding of liberal ideology in all its variants, and, as we shall see, to Marxian socialism. So thoroughly does it permeate the individualistic philosophies of Hobbes, Locke, and the classical economists that it often remains the unspoken assumption for many debatable social issues. With Hobbes, the state of nature is a state of disorder, of the war of all against all. The material stinginess of physical nature reappears as the ethical stinginess of human nature in the isolated ego's ruthless struggle for survival, power, and felicity. The chaotic consequences that the state of nature must inevitably yield can only be contained by the ordered universe of the state. What is more important than Hobbes's notion of the state is the extent to which he divests nature of all ethical content. Even more unerring than Kepler, who marvelled at the mathematical symmetry of the universe, Hobbes is the mechanical materialist par excellence. Nature is mere matter and motion, blind in its restless changes and permutations, without goal or spiritual promise. Society, specifically the state, is the realm of order precisely because it improves the individual's chances to survive and pursue his private aims. It is not far-fetched to say that Hobbes's ruthless denial of all ethical meaning to the universe, including society, creates the intellectual setting for a strictly utilitarian interpretation of justice. To the degree that liberal ideology was influenced by Hobbes's work, it was forced to deal with justice exclusively as a means to secure survival, felicity, and the pragmatics of material achievement. Locke, who tried so often this Hobbesian legacy with a benign concept of human nature, deals more explicitly with external nature. But, ironically, he does so only to degrade it further as the mere object of human labour. Nature is the source of proprietorship, the common pool of resources from which labour removes the individual's means of life and wealth. Whatsoever man removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labour with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. Lest it be thought that nature and labour join people together, Locke assures us that the very opposite is the case. Quote, "It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, hath by this labour something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. For this labour, being the unquestionable property of the labourer, no man but he can have a right to do what is once joined to, at least where there is enough, and as good left in common for others." End quote. What raises Locke beyond mere proprietary platitudes is the pronounced function he imparts to labour. The isolated ego, which Hobbes rescued from the hazards of mechanical nature, by a political covenant, Locke strikingly rescues by an economic one. So far, Hobbes and Locke are as one in the extent to which they filter any spiritual qualities out of their social philosophies. Where Hobbes is arrested by the problem of human survival, in a basically chaotic or meaningless world, Locke advances the higher claims of property and person, and perhaps more striking for our age, the crucial role of labour in shaping that most fascinating piece of property, the individual itself. For it is, quote, "labour in the beginning that gave a right of property, wherever any one was pleased to employ it, upon what was common," unquote. And it was property, quote, "which labour and industry began," unquote, that underpinned the compact and agreement that created civil society. The individual achieves its identity as the, quote, "proprietor of his own person," and the actions or labour of it." Unquote. Human activity, in effect, is human labour. How profoundly Locke opened the gulf between Greco-Christian thought and liberal ideology can best be seen when we recall that for Aristotle, human activity is basically thinking, and for Christian theology, spirituality. This reduction of social thought to political economy proceeded almost unabashedly into the late 19th century, clearly reflecting the debasement of all social ties to economic ones. Even before modern science denuded nature of all ethical content, the burgeoning market economy of the late Middle Ages had divested it of all sanctity. The division within the medieval guilds between wealthy members and poor ultimately dispelled all sense of solidarity that had united people beyond a commonality of craft. Naked self-interest established its eminence over public interest. Indeed, the destiny of the latter was reduced to that of the former. The objectification of people as mere instruments of production fostered the objectification of nature as mere natural resources. Work, too, had lost its sanctity as a redemptive means for rescuing a fallen humanity. It was now reduced to a discipline for bringing external nature under social control and human nature under industrial control. Even the apparent chaos that market society introduced into the guild, village, and family structure that formed the bases of the pre-industrial world was seen as the surface effects of a hidden lawfulness in which individual self-interest, by seeking its own ends, served the common good. This liberal ideology persisted into the latter part of the 20th century, where it is celebrated not merely within the confines of church and academy, but by the most sophisticated devices of the mass media. But what, after all, was this common good in a society that celebrated the claims of self-interest and naked egotism? And what redemption did onerous toil provide for a humanity that had been summoned to surrender its spiritual ideals for material gain? If liberalism could add nothing to the concept of justice other than Locke's hypostatization of proprietorship, and if progress meant nothing more than the right to unlimited acquisition, then most of humanity had to be excluded from the pale of the good life by patently self-serving class criteria of justice and progress. By the end of the 18th century, liberal theory had not only been debased to political economy, but to a totally asocial doctrine of interest. That human beings acted in society at all could be explained only by the compulsion of needs and the pursuit of personal gain. In the mechanical world of matter and motion, egotism had become for isolated human monads what gravitation was for material bodies. The most important single effort to provide liberalism with an ethical credo beyond mere proprietorship and acquisition was made in the same year that the French sans-culotte toppled the most luminous stronghold of traditional society. In 1789, Jeremy Bentham published his Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, advancing the most coherent justification for private interest as an ethical good. In a majestic opening that compares with Rousseau's Social Contract and Marx's Communist Manifesto, Bentham intoned the great law of utilitarian ethics. Quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as determine what we should do." End quote. In any case, they, quote, "govern us in all we do, in all we say, and all we think," unquote. Thus, caught up in the universal principles that predetermine our behavior irrespective of our wishes, a formula that lies at the heart of scientism, whether liberal or socialist, Bentham abandoned metaphor and declamation for a calculus of pain and pleasure, a system of moral bookkeeping that identifies evil with the former and good with the latter. This utilitarian calculus is explicitly quantifiable. Social happiness is seen as the greatest good for the greatest number. Here, social good comprises the sum of pleasures derived by the individuals who make up the community. To the sensory atomism of Locke, Bentham added an ethical atomism of his own, both of which seem to form exact fits to a monadic age of free-flowing egos in a free-falling marketplace. Quote, "Sum up all the values of all the pleasures on the one side, and those of all the pains on the other. The balance, if it is on the side of the pleasure, will give the good tendency of the act upon the whole, and if on the side of pain, the bad tendency of it upon the whole." End quote. What applies to the individual, in Bentham's view, can be extended to the community as the sum of all good and bad tendencies, to which each of its members is exposed. Rarely do we encounter in Justitia's checkered career a more unadorned attunement of her scale to ethical quanta. Even acts that yield a calculable predominance of pleasure or pain are atomized and lend themselves, in Bentham's view, to clearly delineable episodes, just like chapters in the Richardson novel. What is striking about Bentham's ethical atomism is the kind of rationality he employs. Aristotle's ethics, too, was built on the idea of happiness. But happiness in the Greek view was a goal we pursued as an end in itself, and not as a means to something else. It was derived from the very nature of human beings, as distinguished from all other living things, a nature that could be formulated with the precision of mathematics. If happiness was a rational and virtuous way of life, as Aristotle argued, it attained its full realization in the contemplative mind and in an ethical mean that rose above excess of any kind. Bentham, by contrast, offered his readers no ethics in any traditional sense of the term, but rather a scientistic methodology based on a digital calculation of pleasurable and painful units. The qualitative intangibles of human sentiments were coded into arithmetic values of pleasure and pain that could be cancelled or diminished to yield surpluses of either happiness or misery. But to dismiss Bentham merely as an ethical bookkeeper is to miss the point of his entire approach. It is not the ethical calculus that comprises the most vulnerable features of utilitarian ethics, but the fact that liberalism had denatured reason itself into a mere methodology for calculating sentiments, with the same operational techniques that bankers and industrialists use to administer their enterprises. Nearly 2 centuries later, this kind of rationality was to horrify a less credulous public as a form of thermonuclear ethics in which varying sums of bomb shelters were to yield more or less casualties in the event of nuclear war. That a later generation of liberals, represented by John Stuart Mill, rebelled against the crude reduction of ethics to mere problems of functional utility, did not rescue liberalism from a patent loss of normative concepts of justice and progress. Indeed, if interests alone determine social and ethical norms, what could prevent any ideal of justice, individuality, and social progress from gaining public acceptance? The inability of liberal theory to answer this question in any terms other than practical utility left it morally bankrupt. Henceforth, it was to preach a strictly opportunistic message of expediency rather than ethics, of meliorism rather than emancipation, of adaptation rather than change. But we are concerned for the moment with liberalism not as a cause or ideology, but rather as the embodiment of justice. Anarchism and revolutionary socialism profess to be concerned with freedom. Fascism is concerned neither with justice nor freedom, but merely with the instrumentalities of naked domination. Its various ideologies are purely opportunistic. Hence, the fate of justice reposes with the fate of the ideas of such serious thinkers as John Stuart Mill and his followers. Their failure to elicit an ethics from justice that could rest on its rule of equivalence leaves only Bentham's utilitarian ethics, a crude, quantitative theory of pains and pleasures, as justice's denouement. Let us not deceive ourselves that Bentham's methodology, or for that matter, his ethics, have dropped below the current ideological horizon. It still rises at dawn and sets at dusk, resplendent with the multitude of colours produced by its polluted atmosphere. Terms like pleasure and pain have not disappeared as moral homilies. They merely compete with terms like benefits and risks, gains and losses, the tragedy of the commons, triage, and the lifeboat ethic. The inequality of equals still prevails over the equality of unequals. What is so stunning to the careful observer is that if justice never came to compensate, but merely to reward, its spirit has finally become mean and its coinage small. Like every limited ideal, its history has always been greater than its present, but the future of justice threatens to betray even its claims to have upheld the rights of the individual and humanity. For as human inequality increases in fact, if not in theory, its ideology of equivalence assails the ideal of freedom with its cynical opportunism and sleazy meliorism. Chapter 7. The Legacy of Freedom. The most triumphant moment of Justitia does not occur in her apotheosis as bourgeois right, when the marketplace gives materiality to the rule of equivalence. Rather, it occurs in those times of transition when justice is extricating itself from the parochial world of organic society. This is the heroic moment of innocence, before the materiality of equivalence, in the form of the commodity reclaims in early idealism. At this time, justice is emergent, creative and fresh with promise, not worn down by history and the musty logic of its premises. The rule of equivalence is still loosening the grip of the blood oath, patriarchy, and the civic parochialism that denies recognition into individualism and a common humanity. It is opening society's door to personality with all its wild eccentricities, and to the stranger as the shadowy figure of the outsider. But by the bourgeois era, particularly its 19th century cultural apogee, individual fulfillment reveals itself as naked egotism, and the dream of a common humanity becomes the threadbare cloak for harsh social inequalities. Penalty for reward is inscribed all over the face of the century and measured out unrelentingly in the cruel dialectic of the inequality of equals. Heaven and hell indeed hang together, as Horkheimer and Adorno observe. What then of freedom, of the equality of unequals? Where does it begin to separate from the liberatory achievements of justice and pick up its own thread of development? I do not mean a return to organic society. Instead, I mean a new advance that will include the individuality fostered by justice's maxim of equals and the shared participation of the individual in a common humanity. The word freedom initially appears in a Sumerian cuneiform tablet that gives an account of a successful popular revolt against a highly oppressive regal tyranny thousands of years ago. In The Sumerians, Samuel Noah Kramer tells us that, quote, "In this document we find the word freedom used for the first time in man's recorded history. The word is amagi, which literally means return to the mother," unquote. Alas, Kramer wonders, we still do not know why this figure of speech came to be used for freedom. Thereafter, freedom retains its features as a longing to return to the mother. Whether to organic society's matricentric ambience or to nature perceived as a bountiful mother. The classical world is preoccupied with justice, fair dealings, individual liberty, and enfranchisement of the outsider in the world city, rather than with freedom's equality of unequals. Freedom is viewed as utopistic and fanciful, and relegated to the underworld of repressed dreams, mystical visions and Dionysian excesses like the Saturnalia and other ecstatic mystical rituals. As theory and an explicit ideal, freedom again rises to the surface of consciousness with Christianity, when Augustine places the wayfaring heavenly city into the world as a force for social change. He also locates it in a meaningful, purposeful historical drama that leads to humanity's redemption. Hence, humankind is removed from the meaningless recurring cycles of ancient social thought. Here, we encounter the radical face of history's double meaning, as it was developed by the Christian fathers. According to Augustine, creation initiates a distinctly linear, time-laden evolution analogous to the individual's own stages of life. The period of Adam to Noah is humanity's childhood. Noah to Abraham is boyhood. Abraham to David, its youth, and David to the Babylonian captivity, its manhood. After this, history passes into two concluding periods, beginning with the birth of Jesus and ending with the Last Judgment. Within this history, the heavenly and earthly cities are engaged in an irreconcilable series of conflicts, in which each achieves episodic triumphs over the other. However, a dialectic of corruption and germination assures the triumph of the heavenly city over the earthly. Redemption thus ceases to be the arbitrary whim of a deity. It ceases, in effect, to be exclusively transcendental and becomes anthropological. History imparts to faith a logic and intelligibility that inspires hope, meaning, and action. Augustine's view of redemption is prospective rather than retrospective. The golden age of the pagan now lies in a historically conditioned future, one that is to be attained in a battle with evil rather than a long-lost natural past. In Augustine's time, this vision served to diffuse the millenarian hopes of the emerging Christian world for an imminent second coming of Christ. But it later haunted the church like a postponed debt, whose claims must be honoured by its clerical creditors sooner or later. The decisive idea in Augustine's work, observes Ernst Bloch, is that, quote, "For the first time, a political utopia appears in history. In fact, it produces history. History comes to be as saving history in the direction of the kingdom, as a single unbroken process extending from Adam to Jesus on the basis of the Stoic unity of mankind and the Christian salvation it is destined for." End quote. By placing Christian eschatology in a historical context, Augustine initiates a concept of utopia that is earthbound and future-oriented. History has a goal that extends beyond cyclic return to a final culmination in the practical affairs of humanity. Biblical narrative parallels personal development. Hence it ceases to be an inventory of miracles, rewards, and punishments. The world order, in turn, ceases to be the consequence of a transcendental world that exists beyond it, however much Augustine permeates it with the will of God. It is an order in which that will is immanent in the earthly world as well, an order that includes causally related events as well as miraculous ones. But Augustine not only provides us with the first notion of a political utopia, he emphatically denigrates political authority. To be sure, early Christianity had always viewed political entanglements as tainted. Like the Stoics before them, the church fathers of the late Roman world articulated the individual's feelings of increasing separation from all levels of political power and social control. Gone were the popular assemblies of the polis, the hoplites, or militias of citizen farmers, the citizen amateurs chosen by lot to administer the day-to-day affairs of the community. The Roman Republic and More markedly, the empires had long replaced them with senatorial and imperial rulers, professional armies, and an elaborate, far-flung bureaucracy. For Stoicism and Christianity to preach a gospel of abstinence from political activism, merely expressed in spiritual and ethical terms, a situation that had become firmly established as fact. It neither challenged the political order of the time, nor acquiesced to it, but merely acknowledged existing realities. By contrast, Augustine did more than counsel indifference to political authority. He denounced it. Franz Neumann, describing what he calls the Augustinian position, acutely notes the dual nature of this denunciation. Augustine viewed politics as evil. Quote, "Political power is coercion, even in origins and purpose." Unquote. For human to dominate human is unnatural. Quote, "Only at the end of history, with the advent of the kingdom of God, can and will coercion be dispensed with." From this philosophy derive two radically different, yet inherently related attitudes, that of total conformism and that of total opposition to political power. If politics is evil, withdrawal is mandatory. Forms of government and objectives of political power become irrelevant. Salvation can be attained through faith, and early life should be a mere preparation for it. Monasticism is the first consequence. By the same token, however, the demand for the immediate destruction of politics and the establishment of a kingdom of God may equally be supported by the Augustinian premise. The Anabaptist movement of the Reformation era was perhaps the most striking manifestation of the total rejection of society. End quote. More accurately, the Anabaptists rejected the political world represented by the state. The conflict latent in this dual message of political quietism and messianic activism could hardly be suppressed once the Christian doctrine became increasingly secularized. The Church was the major factor behind its own transformation from an otherworldly into a worldly power, notably by its growing conflict with the temporal power to which Pauline Christianity had entrusted humanity's worldly destiny. The most explosive of these conflicts developed in the 11th century when Pope Gregory VII forbade the lay investiture of bishops and claimed this authority exclusively for the papacy. The dispute reached its culmination when the Holy See excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV for contumaciously resisting the Church's claims, and called upon Henry's subjects to deny him fealty. This was more than an extension of ecclesiastical power. Gregory was asserting the higher authority of spiritual over political power. In so doing, he challenged political power and placed it in a tainted ethical light. Accordingly, the Pope traced political authority as such back to evil and sin in a fashion that makes the Augustinian position seem tepid by comparison. Thus declaimed Gregory, quote, "Who does not know that kings and rulers took their beginning from those who, being ignorant of God, have assumed, because of blind greed and intolerable presumption, to make themselves masters of their equals, namely men, by means of pride, violence, bad faith, murder, and nearly every kind of crime, being incited thereto by the prince of the world, the devil?" End quote. Taken by themselves, these heady words match the most stinging attacks that were to be levelled against political authority by the revolutionary, chiliastic leaders of the Reformation period. Thereafter, Christian doctrine became increasingly social and secular until religious disputes barely concealed harsh clashes over the implications of the Augustinian position. The eventual submission of sacerdotal to secular power did not terminate these conflicts. To the contrary, it made them outrageously worldly in character. In the 12th century, John of Salisbury bluntly turned his back on the feudal hierarchy of his day, a hierarchy based on the unquestioning obedience of ruled to ruler, and proceeded to explore the validity of governance by law. Tyranny, by which John meant the disregard of law as dictated by the people, was beyond legitimation and could be overthrown by force. This far-reaching, avowedly revolutionary position was drawn not from the Christian father Augustine, but from the Republican theorist Cicero. Its medievalistic references to princes and kings aside, it had a distinctly Republican ring. While Christian doctrine drifted into Thomistic scholasticism, with its explicit justification of hierarchy and its designation of political power as natural, Joachim of Fiore, almost contemporary of John of Salisbury, brought the radical eschatology of Christianity completely into the open. Joachim's goal was not to cleanse the church and state of their horrors, observes Bloch. They were abolished instead, or rather a lux nova was kindled in it, the third kingdom, as the Joachimites called it. The third kingdom, the coming historical stage illumined by the Holy Spirit, was to succeed the Old Testament stage based on the Father and the New Testament stage based on the Son. With the illumination provided by the Holy Spirit, all masters, both spiritual and temporal, would disappear, and wheat would replace the grass brought by the Old Testament era and the sheaves brought by the New. Joachism fed directly into the great chiliastic movements that swept through the medieval world in the 14th century and surfaced again during the Reformation. Bloch's assessment of Joachim's influence is worth noting. Quote, "For centuries, genuine and forged writings of Joachim's remained in circulation. They appeared in Bohemia and in Germany, even in Russia, where sects aspiring to original Christianity were clearly influenced by the Calabrian preaching. The Hussites, Kingdom of God in Bohemia, repeated 100 years later in Germany by the Anabaptists, meant Joachim's Civitas Christi. Behind it lay the misery that had come long since. In it lay the millennium whose coming was due, so men struck a blow of welcome. Special attention was paid to the abolition of wealth and poverty. The preaching of those seeming romantics took brotherly love literally and interpreted it financially. During its journey on earth, Augustine had written, the city of God attracts citizens and gathers friendly pilgrims from all nations, regardless of differences due to customs, laws, and institutions that serve material gain and assure earthly peace. The Joachimites' coming civitas Dei, on the other hand, kept a sharp eye on institutions that served material gain and exploitation, and the tolerance it practiced, namely towards Jews and heathens, could not but be alien to international ecclesiasticism. Its criterion for citizenship was not whether a man had been baptized, but whether he heard the fraternal spirit in himself. End quote. The Joachimite financial interpretation of brotherly love carried Christian eschatology beyond the confines of the Augustinian position into a distinctly secular social philosophy and movement. The social theories of Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke owe their secular quality to the assimilation of otherworldliness to this worldliness, a process that begins with John of Salisbury and Joachim of Fiore. Christian social theory, particularly its radical wing, had overcome the duality between heaven and earth on which Pauline Christianity had been nourished. Once the split was transcended, heavenly questions were superseded by practical problems of law, power, authority, equality, and freedom. Pope Gregory VII had opened sluice gates that his era could never again close. Once the Church itself became the plaything of the temporal powers, and the papacy an instrument of Rome's local patriciate, heaven too began to lose its hypnotic power over the human mind, and hope ceased to find refuge in the spiritual dispensation of an otherworldly king. When the Puritans of 1649 removed the head of Charles I in the name of a new religious credo, they effectively removed the head of their Heavenly Father as well. In the following century, the Parisian sans-culottes were to remove kingly and queenly heads, with invocations to no higher authority than reason. Christian historicism, with its promise of an early utopistic future, taken together with the Church's appeals for direct popular support against anti-clerical abuses by lay authority, had a strong influence on radical social movements of medieval and early modern times. Until Marxian socialism acquired the status of official dogma in nearly half the world, Christianity was to play a predominant role in the spiritual and intellectual life of Western society. No doctrine could kindle more fervent hopes among the oppressed, only to dash them to the ground when the clerical and civil powers periodically combined to repress subversive sects and radical popular movements. Contradictions within Christian religious precepts were to provide the grindstone for sharpening the knives of social criticism, which, in turn, gave rise to new ideas for social reconstruction. Despite its patently conflicting messages, Christianity offered the principles, examples, social metaphors, ethical norms, and above all, a spiritual emphasis on the virtuous life that were to foster an unprecedented zealotry in periods of social rebellion. Its ethical impact on medieval movements for change contrasts sharply with economistic and materialistic explanations of human behavior. Such a tremendous movement as Anabaptism, a movement that enlisted nobles and learned sectarians, as well as poor townspeople and peasants, in support of apostolic communism and love, could not have emerged without anchoring its varied ideals in Christian ethical imperatives. These ideals outweighed life itself in the eyes of its acolytes. To describe religion, particularly Christianity, as the heart of a heartless world, as Marx does, is not to dismiss religion, but to acknowledge its autonomous existence as an ethical dimension of society. From the late Roman world to the Enlightenment, every significant radical ideal was cast in terms of Christian doctrine. Even when people looked backward toward a lost golden age or forward to a last kingdom, they often also looked upward to a heavenly dispensation for inspiration, if not validation. Christian doctrine was a stellar body in the world's firmament of belief, a source of illumination that would not be discarded as a guiding force in human affairs until the 18th or 19th century. Freedom's equality of unequals had never totally disappeared as a principle of compensation, if only because this principle could be used to provide credibility for privilege as well as equality. Where justice assailed the inequities of class rule, or its claims to status as a matter of birth, the notion of compensation reinforced these inequities by according to unequals a greater compensatory increment in power, wealth, and authority. Compensation acknowledged the superiority of the slave master and feudal lord over their slaves and serfs. It accorded the ruler the authority and means to live according to the norms of rulership. Ironically, the nobles of imperial Rome and feudal Europe claimed the freedom to live on very unequal terms with the oppressed and exploited beneath them. Normally, it was to Caesar and the feudal monarchs, not to local satraps and lords, that the oppressed turned for justice. Neither freedom nor justice were prevalent as principles in European manorial society. Rather, a fairly precise system of rights and duties was established between ruling and ruled classes, based on highly modified customs and traditions that derived from tribal times. Territorial lords were to be compensated for their military prowess in defending the lands and subjects from barbarian raiders, and from the dynastic conflicts generated by feudal society itself. Villeins, peasants, and serfs were also to be compensated for the material support they gave to secure safety and peace in a very troubled era. In effect, compensation for inequalities had been denatured into privilege. Wherever this system of rights and duties broke down, the oppressed often returned to the egalitarian premises that had nourished the principle of compensation. To the oppressed, what held for the territorial lords could easily hold for them. They, too, could claim the privileges conferred by inequality. Hence, the backward look to a golden age was not always evidence of nostalgia, or of an ethical drama in which authority and oppression were unavoidable penalties for original sin and loss of innocence. Often, the backward look involved an attempt by the oppressed to restore freedom's equality of unequals, to recover the very premises from which ruling classes had reworked ancient traditions to support their own compensatory privileges. But with Christianity, this backward look acquired a vibrant sense of futurity, and not only because of the Augustinian or Joachimite historicism. To the pagan world, the memory of a golden age elicited basically quietistic and nostalgic responses. Even in the ancient cycles of eternal recurrence, it was doomed to be succeeded by faulted epochs. From Plato to the Stoics, social theory contains a quietistic core, a sense of fatalism and resignation in which ideal polis are frozen in their ideality and in their distance from the real world, or else reduced to private gardens as loci for an ethical retreat. Within any given social cycle, the Golden Age could no longer be expected to return. There was no point in striving for it. All epochs in the cycle were as predetermined as the inexorable cycles of nature. To be sure, the oppressed or the morally inspired did not always heed this fate that the ruling classes of antiquity imparted to history. Plebeians and slaves could rise to great insurrectionary conflicts, but rarely were domination and slavery brought into question. The slave's dream of freedom, as some short-lived but successful rebellions suggest, was to turn the slave master into a slave. Vengeance, not hope, was the poor man's notion of settling his accounts with his oppressor. Christianity, by contrast, offered a different vision. Authority, laws, domination, and servitude were explained by the need to restrain a fallen humanity. Sin, like the afflictions in Pandora's box, had been released by woman's accursed curiosity. But redemption and its abolition of authority, laws, domination, and servitude lay in the offing. The Christian clergy retained an atavistic stance toward absolution and brought the flock into motion to fight sin, Muslim infidels, and the territorial lords as the needs of the church hierarchy required. Hence, to look back to the Garden of Eden was actually to look forward to its recovery, not to bemoan its disappearance. The ethical drama that eventually would yield its recovery was an active struggle with the powers of evil and wrong. Humanity made its own history. Yahweh, as the transcendental expression of will, had been transmuted into the many existential wills of the Christian congregation. With the Christian emphasis on individuality and a universal humanity, Fortuna now returned in a more spiritual light to remove any notion of predetermination of one's personal fate, a feeling that Calvin was to challenge during the Reformation. The Christian ethical drama became a battleground, not a stage, that was occupied by free-willing combatants, not stylized, carefully rehearsed actors. The masks used in classical drama to express an actor's sentiments were removed to show the real face of the medieval and modern individual. If there was any script, it was the Bible, and with all its wrenching ambiguities, not the cold and carefully wrought hexameters of ancient tragedy. This battleground was marked by several striking features that greatly influenced European struggles for freedom. Its paradisical gardens were located not only in time but also in place. Consigned as they might be to the past, they nevertheless occupied a geographic area on Earth. As such, they posed a constant subversive affront to the class and priestly emphasis on the supernatural, with its afterlife rewards for obedience and virtue. This implicit opposition of nature to supernature, of earthly rewards to heavenly, is crucial. It flouts the authority of heaven and tests the ingenuity of humanity to find its haven of freedom and abundance within life itself and on the earth. Hence, such visions were not a utopos, or no place, but a distinct someplace with definite boundaries. Historically, attempts to locate the Garden of Eden were made repeatedly, not only symbolically, but also geographically. Ponce de Leon's pursuit of the Fountain of Youth is merely one of the innumerable explorations that for centuries occupied the lives and claimed the fortunes of explorers. Certainly, the oppressed believed that the Garden of Eden was still on earth, not in heaven, in nature, not in supernature. In the outrageously heretical medieval image of such a garden, the land of Cocaigne, this place was the creation of a bountiful maternal natural world, an Amagi, not an austere paternal deity. The utterly anarchic 14th century version of this someplace broadly satirizes the Christian heaven, against which it opposes an almost Dionysian, sensuously earthy world of nature, a world that, like maternal love, gives freely of its fruits to a denied and deserving humanity. Quote, "Though paradise be merry and bright, Cocaigne is a fairer sight. What is there in paradise but grass and flowers and green boughs?" Unquote. By contrast, Cocaigne has rivers great and fine, of oil, milk, honey, and wine. Food is bountiful, cooked and baked by nature's own hand. Eternal day replaces night, peace replaces strife, and, quote, "all is common to young and old, to stout and stern, meek and bold," end quote. Cocaigne, merely by virtue of its location, openly flouts clerical sensibilities. Quote, "Far in the sea to the west of Spain is a land called Cocaigne," end quote. In his analysis of the poem, A.L. Morton adds, quote, "This westward placing clearly connects Cocaigne with the earthly paradise of Celtic mythology. Throughout the Middle Ages, the existence of such a paradise was firmly believed in, but the Church always placed this paradise in the East and strongly opposed the belief in a Western paradise as a heathen superstition. In spite of this ecclesiastical opposition, the belief persisted. So strong were these beliefs that in the form of St. Brandon's Isle, the Western paradise had to be Christianized and adopted by the Church itself, and a number of expeditions were sent out from Ireland and elsewhere in search of the Isle. Nevertheless, the fact that Cocaigne is a Western island is an indication that the Cocaigne theme is of popular and pre-Christian character, and the Western placing may in itself be taken as one of the specifically anti-clerical features. End quote. The heretical insouciance of the poem is revealed most clearly in its flagrantly common tastes, if not in its déclassé and bohemian tone. To the modern mind, it is notable for its lack of any technological means to achieve its bounty. Such a technology, in any case, was hopelessly beyond human achievement at the time. More importantly, there is no toil in kokegni, no compulsory exertion, no need to master oneself or others for labor. Kokegni is created not by humanity, its arts, or its institutions, but by nature, which gives freely of its wealth and pleasures. The notion of nature as a realm of scarce resources, which is articulated clearly in Aristotle's Politics, has yielded to the notion of nature as a realm of plenty and abundance. Hence, no need exists for institutions and restrictions of any kind, or for hierarchy and domination. Indeed, kokegni is not a society at all, but a fecund land, and its human inhabitants may live in it without placing any constraints on their desires. It is libertarian, indeed deliciously libertine, because nature is no longer the product of a stern, demanding creator. It is instead an emancipated nature that goes hand in hand with an emancipated humanity and an emancipation of human fantasy. The premises on which the entire vision of kokegni rests are strangely modern. Peace, harmony and freedom, in a most absolute sense, are predicated on material superfluity. People require no protection or rule. Their very desire can be satisfied without techniques or the need to bring other human beings into personal or institutional subjugation. No war, conflict, or violence mars kokegni's landscape. In the sheer splendor of its plenty and the givenness of nature, the pleasure principle and reality principle are in perfect congruence. Hence no conceivable tensions need disturb the security and peace of kokegni. Pleasure is the rule, abundance enables desire to replace mere need, because every wish can be fulfilled without exertion or technical strategies. Kokegni further implies a view of human nature that is benign rather than conceived in sin. Humanity is afflicted not because it has eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, but because it has eaten of the bitter root of scarcity. Scarcity is not the penalty of sin, but rather its cause. Given a level of abundance that removes this bitter root, individuals have no need to dominate, manipulate, or empower themselves at the expense of others. The appetite of power and the desire to inflict harm are removed by nature's sheer fecundity. The land of kokegni appears again as a sanctuary of privilege in Rabelais' Abbey of Thalem. But for the present, I wish to emphasize that kokegni is a consumerist concept of freedom, involving no labor, techniques, or canons of productivity. This concept is woven through the broad, popular movements of history for centuries, and even where it ebbs briefly, kokegni is recovered by heretical elites, by the elect, who acknowledge no authority or denial of pleasure other than that dictated by their own inner light. Allowing unrestrained freedom to consume, to take from life its profit riches, this vision of freedom acquires a distinctly utopian form. It passes from imagery and geography into a cerebral sensibility, a philosophy as it were, and a way of life that is represented by the brethren of the free spirit. During the Reformation, it degenerates into the military communism of the Adamite plunderers. In our own time, it acquires distinctly aesthetic qualities among the symbolist and surrealist artists, whose demand for the fulfillment of desire are inscribed as the slogans on the walls of Paris during the May to June events of 1968. Charles Fourier's utopian visions incorporate the problematic of scarcity, need, and labor that this tradition of freedom seeks to resolve by natural, elitist, or aesthetic means. But his phalansteries, the basic units of his utopia, are technically oriented and involve a recourse to strategies that rooted only partly in a Cockaigne imagery. In contrast to these consumerist concepts, we also witness the emergence of productivist concepts of freedom. These notions of humanity's ability to create a communistic, sharing, and non-authoritarian society have their material roots in science, techniques, and the rational use of labor. In this vision, the means that will yield the reconciliation of human with human are supplied not by nature, but by man himself. Utopias of plenty will be created by his labor and consciousness, by his capacity to organize society for the attainment of producer-oriented ends. Freedom thus is seen as technical rationalization of the means of production, a project often associated with the concept of reason itself. The means, as it were, tend to become the ends of the utopian project and human emancipation. Nature is perceived as neither fecund nor even generous, but in varying degrees and intractable to human goals. Initially, this tendency in the realm of freedom is highly ascetic. Inequality will be overcome by a humane, loving denial of the means of life by fortunate individuals for the less fortunate. Everyone works as best as he or she can to create a common fund of goods that is parceled out according to authentically valid needs. Radical Christian sects like the Hutterites emphasized the ethical rather than material desiderata that come with this simple communistic way of life. Communism to them was a spiritual discipline, not an economy. Later, the concept of a free, productive, communistic community draws its primary, although by no means exclusive, inspiration from economic motives that involve the fostering of self-interest, class interest, and technical innovation. A distinctly bourgeois spirit infuses, if not totally replaces, an ethical ideal. In contrast to visions of a golden age and the last kingdom, the realm of freedom is not seen as a backward-looking world of the past, but a forward-looking world of the future, in which humanity must fashion itself, often in conflict with internal as well as external nature. But to sharply polarize earlier versions of freedom around categories such as consumerist or productivist, hedonistic or ascetic, and naturalistic or anti-naturalistic is grossly artificial and one-sided. Insofar as they aspire to freedom, the sects and movements that commonly are grouped in these categories were opposed to hierarchy as they understood it in their day, particularly in its exaggerated ecclesiastical form, and intuitively favoured a dispensation of the means of life based on the equality of unequals. Beyond these two attributes, however, difficulties arise. Ordinarily, many of the medieval and Reformation visions of freedom were highly eclectic and, like the concept of justice, pregnant with double meanings. Moreover, whether these visionaries regarded themselves as rebels or conformists in regard to Christianity's true meaning, so-called, their ideas were guided by Christian precept. The Bible provided the common realm of discourse and dispute among all parties. Until the Reformation, when the breakdown of feudal society led to an explosion of community experiments, the individuals and groups who held to various libertarian ideals were small in number, often widely scattered, and lived extremely precarious lives. Their ideals were largely formed in the crucible of social transition, in periods of tumultuous change from one historic era to another. Thus, groups that, during the breakdown of the ancient world and the years of early Christianity, might have emphasized a productivist and ascetic outlook, sometimes shifted their perspectives during more stable periods to a consumerist and hedonistic interpretation of freedom. Comparatively large popular movements from the late Imperial Roman era became highly elitist sects during medieval times and developed a harshly predatory view of their rights and their freedoms. Naturalistic folk visions of freedom, like the land of Cocaigne, underwent a strange shifting of meanings, acquiring a rabidly anti-clerical character at one time, becoming a visceral, earthly, and attainable paradise at another time, and providing a source of ribald satire at still a third. The Reformation and the English Revolution of the late 1640s brought virtually all these tendencies to the surface in the form of rebellions and significant practical experiments. After that, they faded away and were supplanted by secular utopias, more systematically wrought ideals, and major social movements such as anarchism and socialism. Hence, when speaking of consumerist or productivist visions of freedom, one must bear in mind that they often merged and changed over time, being embodied either as ideals of small sects or as social movements that gripped the imagination of sizable segments of the population. Although biblical interpretation and exegesis formed the arena for the eschatological debates and conflicts of the late imperial and medieval worlds, the sources for nearly all versions of the Last Kingdom or Last Days were highly eclectic. Ideologically, the opening centuries of the Christian era were no less tumultuous than the Reformation some 1300 years later. The very consolidation of Christianity as an organized body of canon and dogma hung in the balance, less because of its conflicts with entrenched pagan religions than because of its own internal divisions. At the outset, the Pauline Church in Rome, from which Catholicism was to emerge, stood sharply at odds with its Jamesian counterpart in Jerusalem. the two centers of the new faith were divided not only by geography, but also by conflicting views of Christianity as a world religion. Pauline Christianity stood for accommodation to the Roman state and for an ideologically ecumenical orientation toward the Gentiles. Jamesian Christianity centered around a nationalistic resistance to the whore Rome, and around the preservation of a largely Judaic body of traditions. Christianity's problem of distancing itself from its Judaic origins was tragically resolved by the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Thereafter, the Jamesian Church disappeared with the destruction of Judea and the uncompromising zealots who had produced the Christian Messiah. But the Church's drift toward reconciliation with the state now encountered a crisis. The Gnostic revolt, as it has been so broadly depicted, formed a radically unique reinterpretation of the Judeo-Christian doctrine and of the early Church's reconciliatory attitude toward political authority. Viewed from a religious aspect, gnosis is literally illuminated by its Hellenic definition as knowledge. Its emphasis on religion tends to be avowedly intellectual and esoteric, but more so than the Greek ideals of wisdom, Sophia, and reason, nous. Its emphasis on revelation is consistently otherworldly, and its eschatological orientation draws amply on the archaic cosmogonies of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Christianity itself, and a wide variety of pagan cults that invaded Roman society during its decline. Neither Judaism nor Pauline Christianity were immune to any of these far-reaching syncretic melds of religious and quasi-religious belief. But Judaic nationalism aside, their battlegrounds were narrower than those of the Gnostic religions that began to emerge in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Gnosticism must be dealt with very prudently before any of its tendencies are described as a Christian heresy. In its Manichaean form, it is simply a different religion, like Islam or Buddhism. In its Ophite form, it is a total, utterly anarchistic inversion of Christian canon and dogma. And in its Marcionite form, its point of contact with Christianity is both too intimate and too challenging to be regarded as either Christian or non-Christian. In virtually all its forms, and there are too numerous to elucidate here, Gnosticism slowly percolated through the Christian world, affecting later radical sects and movements that were to open startling new visions of personal and social freedom. Gnosticism matured as a rival of Christian doctrine in a medieval Cathari, and it circuitously and indirectly influenced deviations from Christianity such as the Brethren of the Free Spirit. Certain creeds of apostolic Christianity and early historical schisms in Protestantism. It finally reappeared as an increasingly worldly pantheism among revolutionary radicals in the English Revolution, such as Gerard Winstanley, the Digger leader. In these 5 major trends that were to destabilize almost every form of entrenched or emerging orthodoxy, Gnosticism either anticipated or influenced the religio-social conflicts that were to profoundly expand the legacy of freedom. A legacy conceived as a history of not only doctrines but also of social movements. The Gnostic religion, as Hans Jonas has called it in his matchless account of the subject, is much too complex to discuss in detail here. Our proper concerns are those common features that give a remarkably emancipatory quality to doctrines loosely described as Gnostic Christianity. Christian Gnostics shared with other Gnostics a dramatic dualism, a Platonistic doctrine of the 3 souls, and an ethics, if such it can be called, that exhibits very challenging, indeed modern concepts of human freedom and the meaning of the human condition. What unified the Gnostic religion is a cosmogenic drama and an eschatology as compelling as the Judeo-Christian. Basically, the human condition is shaped by a conflict between 2 principles, the good and its other, which commonly is interpreted as an evil, malevolent, or even satanic principle. These principles ordinarily were personified as deities by the Gnostics, but it would be a crucial error to identify them with the Judeo-Christian drama of a heavenly deity and its demonic alter ego. To be sure, Manichaeanism, which became Pauline Christianity's most important rival in the 3rd and 4th centuries, patently absorbed the image of a god who is literally represented by light and a Satan who is conceived as darkness and materiality. Valentinus, circa 125, whose Gnostic theology exercised considerable influence in Rome and North Africa, developed a highly exotic cosmogony of eons that terminated in the person of Jesus, who provides humanity with the gnosis for divining the conflict between the demiurge, the creator of the material world, and the mother or Sophia, who can be represented for our purposes as a banished spiritual principle. Salvation occurs when the cosmos is restored to a universal fullness of spirit by the marriage of Sophia to Jesus. With few exceptions, the Christian Gnostics grouped human souls into the spiritually pure and illuminated pneumatics, the imperfect psychics who could be illuminated, and the hopelessly material hylics, who are incapable by their very constitution of redemption and illumination. These distinctions played a significant role in the imagery of an elect or chosen elite, whose claims upon society are virtually limitless, owing to their own perfect and pure nature. Similar distinctions were to mark some of the most radical heresies of the Middle Ages and Reformation. In terms of Gnosticism's ethical consequences, the doctrine closest to Christianity itself, and perhaps more accessible to a Christological interpretation of personal and social behavior, is the Gospel of Marcion, who precedes Valentinus, a Christian bishop who was later excommunicated from the Roman Church. Marcion started from a highly selective reinterpretation of the New Testament. He does not burden us with the mythological material that often preoccupied the Gnostic teachers, nor does he resort to the dubious allegorical interpretations central to the Catholic theologians of his day and ours. He claims to interpret the meaning of the Gospel and the Passion of Jesus literally. Indeed, to single out in Paul's writings the truly authentic Christian creed. Hence, not only do his views seem to retain a clear Christian identity, a fact that vexed the Church Fathers enormously, but also his work became their most disquieting doctrinal heresy, so-called. Nevertheless, at its core, Marcionism remained irremediably Gnostic and opened the most dramatic cleavage in Christian doctrine, a cleavage in which later heresies were to find refuge. His Gnosticism has a simplicity that is not encountered in other Gnostic teachers. Its very directness gave his heresy far-reaching ethical consequences that were later echoed by such cultic groups as the Ophites in Marcion's own era, the Free Spirit conventicles in the Middle Ages, and the Puritan saints in the English Revolution. Like the Gnostic doctrines generally, Marcion's doctrines are religiously dualistic. The world, including humanity, has been created by a demiurge, an oppressive creator. In marked contrast is a superior, unknown god, an alien, acosmic deity who embodies goodness and is the father of the Christ person. The good God is the alien, even to the people whose salvation Jesus is to achieve. By the same token, this deity is alien to the cosmos that has been created entirely by the demiurge. Each divinity is separate from and antithetical to the other. The demiurge is just. His antithesis, the alien god, is good. Here, Marcion uncannily opposes justness, or justice, to goodness, which, by a mere fraction of a step forward, could yield the concept of freeness. This remarkable antithesis between a calculating, petty justness and a generous, overflowing goodness expresses one of the most remarkable insights in the legacy of freedom. Marcion does not equivocate about the moral contrast created by these two deities. Like the petty, weak, mean-spirited world he has created, the demiurge is worthy of his own product, as the church father Tertullian complained. Quote, "Turning up their noses, the utterly shameless Marcionites take to tearing down the work of the Creator," unquote. And one could add, the Creator himself. As to the good God of Marcion, Tertullian tells us that he is naturally unknown and never except in the Gospel revealed. He is alien to humanity, as he is everything to the demiurge has created. But his overflowing goodness induces him to send his Son into the demiurge's world and redeem its human habitants. Examining Marcion's ethical conclusions raises the question whether he advances any ethics at all. Disapproval, aversion, distaste for the just demiurge and his world are apparent. But there is no evidence that Marcion has any other ethical stance. In a cosmos that is tainted but blameless, and burdened by justice rather than goodness, it is fair to ask whether Marcion believes in the existence of evil, even whether goodness can have meaning beyond its antithetical and polarized relationship to justice. Humanity's redemption seems to involve a transcendence rather than an act of ethical hygiene. Insofar as human behavior is concerned, Marcion preaches a gospel of uncompromising asceticism, not as a matter of ethics, as Hans Jonas observes, but of metaphysical alignment. By refusing to participate in sensual pleasures and worldly events, the Marcionites functioned as obstructionists to the demiurge's creation. The reproduction of the species, for example, merely reproduces the world from which humanity must be rescued. Marcion's amoral asceticism not only provides a sweeping inversion of the ascetic ideal, but also unintentionally lends itself to an utterly libertine approach. The Ophites, a Gnostic cult that surfaced in North America, extended Marcion's amoral stance and his interpretation of the Old Testament to the point of an overt nihilistic morality. Granting Marcion's view of the Old Testament and most of the New Testament as tainting documents of the just God, the Ophites concluded that a correct interpretation of the Garden of Eden allegory ennobles the serpent and Eve. By persuading Eve, and through her, Adam to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, the serpent introduces gnosis into the world. It is not accidental that the just deity views this seduction as original sin, for with gnosis, humanity acquires the means to discover the truly despicable nature of the Creator and unmask him and his narrowness of spirit. Hippolytus, in his accounts of the Perital, an Ophic cult, extends this dramatic inversion to include the murder of Abel by Cain. Quote, "This general serpent is also the wise word of Eve. This is the mystery of Eden. This is the river that flows out of Eden. This is also the mark that was set upon Cain, whose sacrifice the God of this world did not accept, whereas he accepted the bloody sacrifice of Abel. For the Lord of this world delights in blood. This serpent is he who appeared in the latter days in human form at the time of Herod." End quote. Radical amorality thus turns upon asceticism to encourage unrestrained freedom and the open defiance of the demiurge's moral tenets. In contrast to Marcion, the Ophites accept the free soul classification of Gnosticism with its pneumatics, psychics, and hylics. Marcion would not have accepted this prototypic notion of the elect, which infested not only official Christianity, but also many of the radical heresies, so-called, that were ideologically related to Gnosticism. In fact, here we reach the limits of Gnosticism as a gospel of freedom. Things being what they are, only the few, an elite by nature modelled partly on Plato's guardians, albeit without their asceticism and communism, are free to indulge in their every appetite. If Gnosticism had been left at this point, it would have retreated back to a questionable libertinism that could no longer be identified with Marcion's generous libertarian message. What matters is not so much the elitist conclusions that the Gnostic cults adopted by the eschatological strategy they used, a strategy that could easily be divested of its elitist sacrilege. Based on this strategy, the claim of cults such as the Ophites to so-called forbidden things, including orgiastic ones, could also be viewed as a metaphysical alignment. All moral judgment, not only that of the Orthodox Christian, is tainted. The moral code is merely the complement of the physical law, and as such, the internal aspect of the all-pervading cosmic rule, observes Jonas. Quote, both emanate from the Lord of the world as agencies of his rule, unified in the double aspect of the Jewish God as creator and legislator. End quote. Human will in normative law is appropriated, quote, by the same powers that control his body. He who obeys it has abdicated the authority of his self. End quote. To defy the authority of the Creator and his juridical minions was turned from a, quote, merely permissive privilege of freedom into a positive metaphysical interest in repudiating allegiance to all objective norms. End quote. Jonas sees in Gnostic libertinism more than mere defiance. It is, quote, a positive obligation to perform every kind of action with the idea of rendering to nature its own and thereby exhausting its powers. End quote. Accordingly, sinning becomes something like a program. Its completion is a, quote, due rendered as the price of ultimate freedom. End quote. Jonas concludes that it is doubtful whether, quote, the preachers of these views lived up to their own professions. To scandalize has always been the pride of rebels, but much of it may satisfy itself in the provocativeness of doctrine rather than of deeds. Yet, we must not underrate the extremes to which revolutionary defiance and the vertigo of freedom could go on in the value vacuum created by the spiritual crisis. The very discovery of a new vista, invalidating all former norms, constituted an anarchical condition. An excess in thought and life was the first response to import the dimensions of that vista. End quote. But can this exploration of the Gnostics end with a discipline of indiscipline, a wild compulsion to be free? Gnosticism's commitment to goodness and physical indulgence implies the latent existence of more creative impulses than a moral nihilism. We hear the message of Rabelais' Abbey of Thalem, whose devotees are no longer spiritual pneumatics, but earthly rationalists. We also hear the message of Fourier's phalanstery, which resonates with a radically new social, cultural, and technical dispensation. Its psychological cosmos of personal affines, its gastronomic delights, its artistic and variegated organization of labor, its concept of work as play, and its generous, for Fourier's time, commitment to the emancipation of women. No hierarchy or system of domination infects this message. Fourier can be placed, at least partly, in the Gnostic tradition by virtue of his emphasis on human spontaneity, personal freedom, and the refusal to deny the claims of the flesh. This is even more true for Rabelais, perhaps because of his elitist Renaissance proclivities and his clerical background. Ultimately, the denial of justice for goodness and of repression for freedom provide a more secure common ground for the humanistic utopians of the modern world and the Gnostics of the ancient world than their dizzying idiosyncrasies would lead us to believe. We also hear another message. Where imagination is permitted to outstrip all the constraints that ideology, morality, and law place on human creative powers, what emerges is the voice of art, not merely of theology. Religion has always been a ritualized drama that appeals to aesthetic needs as well as to faith. And Gnosticism, shared with the cultic mysteries of the ancient world, as well as with Christianity, a need to achieve a derangement of the senses, an ecstatic union of spirit with body that theology described as a union of worshipper with deity. A world that is rendered askew is a world that can be seen anew, and changed according to the dictates of art as well as reason. Herein lies the great power of imagination that has vitalized radical movements for centuries. A world turned upside down that has been the goal of great anarchic movements from the ancient world to the French student radicals of 1968. Gnosticism, by giving desire an unyielding claim on the entire universe of experience, does not seem to limit its credo of illumination to a limited place in personal life. Its appeal to defiance as an obligation is a program for everyday life. The Gnostic experience, if such it can be called, is not locked into episodic rituals and ceremonies. It is an ongoing, unrelieved calling. Gnosis is expected to transfigure every detail of one's encounter with reality, to create a transmundane reality of goodness that is close to a communion with the true God. To use the language of surrealism, it places a halo over the ordinary things and events that normally drift by us unperceived. The very spontaneity it fosters in the self is the correlate of a permanent state of desire rather than mere need, of a passionate perception of the world rather than one deadened by custom, routine, and predictability. If these creative, indeed aesthetic, aspects of the radical Gnostic programs are depicted accurately, then the closing century of antiquity anticipated a more universal, secular impulse to freedom than a strictly religious interpretation of Gnosticism would lead us to believe. What Gnosticism seems to imply is a colonization of every aspect of human experience by desire. Schiller's dream of an aesthetically enchanted world, and Breton's hypostatization of the marvelous as the explosive grenades that unsought the world of given reality, would be coterminous with the Gnostic experience of ecstatic illumination. But the Gnostics were not political animals in Aristotle's sense of the term. They were not citizens of the polis or cosmopolis, but ultimately of a highly spiritual world. They emphasized inward-oriented experiences, not an active contact with the social world. The Cathari, a Gnostic sect that flourished during the Middle Ages, had a program for self-extinction. Their extreme rejection of the hylic or material, from reproduction to food, would have guaranteed a threat from the demiurge's cosmos, into an utterly ineffable one had the Albigensian crusade of the 13th century not led to their virtual extermination. Communism, which cannot easily be reduced to cultic conventicles, drew its inspiration from Acts in the New Testament and other Judaic writings that Marcion would have banished from Christian canon and dogma. Because it was apostolic in its efforts to establish its ethical legitimacy and superiority against the Church's self-interest and greed, communism has no discernible roots in ancient Gnosticism. But Christianity's ample history, be it the account of its wayward hierarchy or of their heretical opponents, is not a story of doctrinal consistency. Just as the Church was to bend before the onslaught of changing events, so too did the devout congregations outside its fold. By the time of Luther and Calvin, and perhaps most markedly during the English Revolution of the 17th century, heretical and recalcitrant congregations of revolutionary heretical saints, as they call themselves, were to surface from their hidden folds in Christian society and move to the center of political life. We shall investigate the activities of these saints, their various tendencies, their politics, and their growing secularity in the following chapter. Particularly in the British Isles, the Puritan radicals ceased to be mere spiritual conventicles. From religious saints they became God's Englishmen. Once hidden heretical congregations and religious pulpits now occupied the seats of rebellious parliaments, parliamentary rostrums, and perhaps more compellingly the tents, barracks, and military councils of Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army. What is significant about this sweeping entry of Christian heretics into political institutions is not merely the secularity of the development. At heart, most of the erstwhile heretics were theocrats, and not very tolerant ones at that, particularly in matters of religious dogma. The various Puritan sects of the late 16th and early 17th centuries had no love for their enemies and no charity toward papists. However uneasily they lived with one another within a common Protestant fold. But they were nonconformists. Their hatred of authority often greatly exceeded their hatred of official religious dogma. The attempt of official English Protestantism, that is, the Anglican Church's attempt to contain its Presbyterian dissidents, and the dissidents' attempt, once they had become ascendant, to contain the Puritans, was nearly as fierce as the efforts of the English Church as a whole to exorcise its Catholic past. Nonconformity thus introduced a millennia-long tradition of fiery disputes over ecclesiastical structure as such. The church policy raised stormy questions, and finally, rebellions around the right of the king to head the English Church, the right of bishops to control congregations, and the freedom of the congregation, indeed of each member, to answer to no authority whatever beyond the claims of his or her inner voice. Christianity, in effect, had inadvertently spawned a remarkably new politics, so-called. A politics distinctly libertarian in its orientation, often anarchic in its structure, and remarkably unfettered in the restrictions it placed on individual freedom. It had created an ethical arena for a godly citizenship whose libertarian scope was even broader than that of the Athenian concept of citizenship. Unlike the citizen of the polis, the Christian heretic had to recognize that one was answerable only to God, and hence had to be in a higher estate of citizenship in the New Jerusalem than in the earthly city. By visualizing themselves as God's elect, the saints may have been elitists, especially when they were forced by persecution into the medieval and early Reformation, underground of damned heretics. But as the Reformation provided a sweeping impetus for social activism, and as theocracies appeared in Geneva under Calvin, in Scotland under Knox, and finally in England under Cromwell, questions of authoritarian versus libertarian structure ceased to be merely ecclesiastical issues. They became political and social issues as well. The Puritan New Model Army that brought English royalty to its knees and placed King Charles on the scaffold was itself a richly articulated, often raging body of radical congregations, the arena of fiery heretical sermonizers that was represented by rank-and-file agitators, as the soldiers' representatives were actually called, who sat on the Army Council together with Major Generals. Together they formulated and furiously argued over issues of not only military policy, but also social and political policy. On at least 2 occasions, Cromwell nearly lost control of his own military saints in near or outright mutinies. By spawning nonconformity, heretical conventicles, and issues of authority over person and belief, Christianity created not merely a centralized authoritarian papacy, but also its very antithesis, a quasi-religious anarchism. Up to the 17th century, and for several generations later, particularly in America, the political and social structures of freedom were as central to Christian discourse as were issues of religious ideology. From the 18th century Enlightenment until our own time, the waning of this realm of discourse on the structures of freedom was to have the same tragic consequences as the secularization of the individual and the disenchantment of personality, to which I have already alluded. The moral issues of freedom were to suffer a decline with the secularism introduced by Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Bentham, and the Victorian liberals. In addition, the very notion that freedom, that is, active citizenship, in the Periclean and Hellenic sense, presupposes the existence and development of certain distinct libertarian institutions, was to be eclipsed by debates and analyses on the subjects of property ownership, the mystique of nationhood and the nation-state, and the tendency to equate institutional centralization with social rationalism. Hobbes, Locke, and Marx were obviously concerned with security and property when they did not discourse on the nature and the need of centralized authority. The active revolutionaries of the modern era, Cromwell, Robespierre, Babeuf, Blanqui, and Lenin, to cite the most familiar of the lot, were dogmatic centralists who often moved beyond the limits of liberal republicanism in order to foster highly authoritarian political forms. Except for rejoinders by the anarchists and certain utopian socialists who had emerged from the French Revolution, Christian heretics faded out of the revolutionary tradition into a historical limbo, at least until comparatively recent times. The nation-state was now equated with community, the notion of a representative republic with the direct democracy of the polis. The very terms of the debate over authority had become so distorted that the debate itself virtually ceased to be intelligible to later generations. The imagery of a recurring history, largely cyclic in character, often replaced Christianity's eschatological vision of the last days, with its populist reward of a land of Cocagne, or at least an earthly Jerusalem. The republican ideal that permeated the Great French Revolution was always haunted by a Caesarist shadow, a republican Bonapartism that its own contemporary historians justified as a stabilizing factor in Europe's march toward freedom, specifically toward freedom of trade. The Jacobins read Plutarch not only as a guide to Roman virtue, but also as a revolutionary handbook. Perhaps it was more germane as a source of social forecasts than Rousseau's Social Contract, which was read as a source of social theory. They awaited their Napoleon as surely as the Roman plebs awaited their Caesar. Seeing the world with the new sense of recurrence that had replaced the Christian emphasis on a linear history, they viewed their cards as stacked and accepted the fall of the Republic itself fatalistically. Indeed, in almost a dreamlike trance. If Robespierre's personal passivity between his overthrow and his execution is any indication. With the exception of the Paris Commune of 1871, which exploded as an anarchic confederal image of a France administered by a commune composed of decentralized communes, European socialism had decorated itself with republican trappings at best and dictatorial ones at worst. By the autumn of 1917, Lenin had combined Brutus and Caesar in one person. Despite his slogan of "all power to the Soviets," and even earlier in the summer of the same year, "all power to the shop committees," a strictly anarcho-syndicalist demand, Lenin readily dispensed with both forms and replaced them by the party as a state organ. The party as such was the unique structural innovation of the post-Reformation era. Its contemporaneity and its impact on political life have rarely been fully appreciated. From the 12th century onward, Christian heretics found their home in the small, highly decentralized, personally intimate conventicle, an almost cellular type of association that fostered an intense form of intimacy and support that was sorely lacking in the larger Christian congregations of the time. These family-like units lent themselves uniquely to a confederal form of interaction among groups from which, cell by cell, a truly organic body politic could be constructed. With the onset of the Reformation, as such groups became increasingly involved in secular affairs, they functioned more like social organisms than like state or political institutions, brotherhoods, such as the Hutterites, even became alternative communistic societies, self-sufficient and complete unto themselves. Perhaps even more striking is the fact that the conventicle form of association never disappeared, despite the ascendancy of the party. Completely secular in character, but no less small, intimate and decentralized, it persisted within the Spanish anarchist movement as the affinity group. From Spain, it spread throughout the world with the recent growth of libertarian organizations, acquiring the names of collective, commune, and cooperative with the emergence of the New Left in the 1960s. By contrast, the party was simply a mirror image of the nation-state, and its fortunes were completely tied to the state's development. The party was meant to be very large, often embracing sizable masses of people who were knitted together bureaucratically in depersonalized, centralized organs. When the party was not in power, it was merely the disinherited twin of the state apparatus, often replicating it in every detail. When the party was in power, it became the state itself. Rarely has it been understood that the Bolshevik Party and the Nazi Party were themselves complete state apparatuses that completely supplanted the pre-existing state structures they, so-called, seized. Hitler, no less than Lenin, was to follow Marx's famous maxim that the state must not be merely occupied, but smashed and replaced by a new one. But Marx was stating a fact about parties in general, that after the French Revolution had already ceased to be a novelty. The modern state could more properly be called a party state than a nation state. Organized from the top downward, with a bureaucratic infrastructure fleshed out by a membership, the party possesses an institutional flexibility that is much greater than that of the official state. Structurally, its repertory of forms ranges from the loosely constructed republic to highly totalitarian regimes. As a source of institutional innovation, the party can be sculpted and molded to produce organization, authoritarian forms with an ease that any state official would envy. And once in power, the party can make these forms part of the political machinery itself. Our own era has given the party an autonomy unequaled by any state institution, from the ancient pharaohs to the modern republics. As the history of Russian Bolshevism and German fascism dramatically demonstrated, parties have shaped European states more readily than states have shaped their parties. Yet, the ascendancy of the nation-state, the party, and, in more recent years, the highly centralized bureaucratic state did not lack ideological reactions against them. The English saints who carried Cromwell to power never encountered the highly coordinated institutions or even the centralized bureaucracies that the absolute monarchs of the European continent and, perhaps, more significantly, the Jacobin despotism of freedom had fashioned in the 17th and 18th centuries. Only the papacy, a feeble institution by the time of the English Revolution, had anticipated any state-like apparatus like the French Revolution was to produce. Tudor and Stuart monarchies, while more centralized than English royal houses of the past, were still too inept to anticipate the world of nation-states that would follow. The French Revolution, first under Robespierre and later under Bonaparte, had fashioned a centralized nation-state with a vengeance. For the first time in Europe, the word saint was replaced by the word patriot. While Marx exulted in the willful ruthlessness of the nation-state, lesser-known revolutionaries drew less favorable, icily clear, anti-authoritarian lessons of their own. One such was Jean Varlet, a popular street orator, or enragé, of 1793, who managed to survive Robespierre's murderous purge of the Parisian radicals. Varlet decided, flatly contradicting his more celebratory contemporary, Gracchus Babeuf, that, quote, government and revolution are incompatible, end quote. This statement, in its sweep and generality, was more unequivocal than any conclusion voiced by the radical saints about the state or even authority. It was anarchist. Indeed, Varlet had been the target of this very epithet by his liberal opponents in the feverish days of 1793, as, in fact, the Levellers had been in the English Revolution more than a century later, when a paper favourable to Cromwell described them as Switzerizing anarchists. The term was to stick and to acquire an ever richer meaning on the margins of European and American society. Both Thomas Paine and Jefferson drew conclusions somewhat similar to those of Varlet from the quasi-dictatorship of the Jacobins and its Bonapartist sequelae. Even more significant than Paine's derogatory remarks about the government were the essentially reconstructive confederal notions that Jefferson advanced to Destert de Tracy in 1811. Concerned with the need for relatively federalist institutional forms at the base of society, Jefferson astutely diagnosed the reasons why Republican France so easily slipped into Imperial France with Napoleon's coup d'etat. The Republican government of France was lost without a struggle because the party of un et indivisible had prevailed. No provincial, and one could easily add local, organizations existed to which the people might rally under the laws. The seats of the Directory were virtually vacant, and a small force sufficed to turn the legislature out of their chamber and salute its leader-chief of the nation. End quote. Having concentrated all political authority in the national state, the Jacobins and their successors, the Directory, had denuded the country of all local, decentralized foci of power from which the revolution could mount an effective resistance to the Bonapartist monarchy. That Jefferson imputed a greater wisdom to the American Revolution for its confederal orientation raises issues that must be deferred to a later discussion. Jefferson himself was no Switzerizing anarchist, and the American Revolution did not reproduce Switzerland's cantonal form of confederation, but a confederalist orientation was to linger on. In the writings of Proudhon, who provocatively declared himself to be an anarchist, in Bakunin, who was to help make anarchism into a movement, and in Kropotkin, who was to vastly enrich anarchism with a wealth of historical traditions. A strikingly pragmatic vision of the technological and social alternatives it offered, and a creative vision drawn largely from the writings of Robert Owen and Charles Fourier. Chapter 8. From Saints to Sellers. But what of the social movements that these expanding notions of freedom were meant to influence? What of the ancient tribes who crossed the threshold into civilization, the plebs and slaves to whom Christianity appealed, the discontented congregations of the elect, and the unruly conventicles of the radical saints, the mystics and realists, the ascetics and hedonists, the pacifists and warriors of Christ, who were to turn the world upside down? Up to now, I have explored the legacy of freedom in terms of its development as a theory. But how did the legacy function as a social movement? And how did the social movement react back upon the legacy, raising problems not only of faith and sainthood, but in our own time, problems of economics, techniques, and the impact of a marketplace of sellers? To understand the legacy of freedom as it was lived, not only thought, we must immerse our ideas in the rich flux of reality and sort out their authenticity in the earthy experiences of the oppressed. Historically, the earliest expression of freedom within the realm of unfreedom consists of popular attempts to restore the irreducible minimum and the circulation of wealth frozen in the temples, manors, and palaces of the ruling elites. The big men, initially the tribal warrior chieftains, later the nobles and monarchs of the secular realm, and their priestly counterparts, were the custodians of society's use values. They collected them in storehouses, an action partly justified by the biblical story of Joseph, and redistributed them according to a hierarchy of values that increasingly reinforced their authority. The early history of civilization is largely an account of the custodians' expanding grip on the productive process, their deployment and rationalization of labor, their control over its fruits, and their personal appropriation of an increasingly larger fraction of the labor process and its social product. But this history is also an account of the mystification of the social wealth they siphoned off to reinforce their power. Treasure, in the form of large ornate structures, costly furnishings and attire, jewels, artworks, storehouses of products, even intangibles such as writing and knowledge, looms over the masses as the materialization of an all-pervasive, malevolent force. The shamans and priests did their work by transforming mundane things into transmundane things, objects into symbols. They thereby reconstructed the very process of generalization, which must itself be emancipated from hierarchy, into the supernatural imagery of transubstantiation. The ancient mysteries invaded the mental processes of humanity and changed them epistemologically from gnosis into the warped form of a sacrament. Real bread was turned into the body of Christ, and real wine into his blood. Even in the distant pre-Christian era of antiquity, the real things that the primordial world generously recycled within the community to satisfy real needs were turned into sacramental things consecrating power and hierarchy. The fetishization of use values long preceded the fetishization of exchange values and market-generated needs. Consolidated as mystified power and authority, the treasure of the ruling elites had to be exorcised. It had to be removed from the hands of the hierarchical strata who guarded it. It also had to be stripped of its mystified traits by a twofold process of dissolution. Firstly, by restoring this treasure to the natural, comprehensible forms of mundane use values in order to render authority itself mundane and controllable. Secondly, by recirculating wealth within the community in order to restore the principle of usufruct. Accordingly, by plundering, redistributing, or even purifying property with the torch of the incendiary, the masses were not merely oriented toward a consumerist disposition of wealth, but were also demystifying its institutional function as a force for domination, as well as restoring the primordial principles of the irreducible minimum and the equality of unequals. In this tradition-laden version of the black redistribution, we find a rational attempt to subvert the hold of objects as the incarnation of hierarchy and domination over the lives of human beings. These expropriative explosions of the people, which so often are dismissed as the plundering expeditions of primitive rebels, to use Eric Hobsbawm's fatuous characterization, were surprisingly sophisticated in their intentions. They recur throughout history. Even the most unadorned consumerist visions of freedom have a broader social dimension than we normally suppose. They were concerned not only with the satisfaction of human needs, but with the desymbolization of power and property. But two epistemologies are in conflict here. The ruling classes react to the black redistribution not only with personal fear and a savage lust for vengeance, but with horror toward the desecration of their hierarchical vision of order, so-called. The black redistribution affronts not only their own proprietary claim to the social product, but also their view of the social product as a cosmos of proprietary claims. Perhaps the earliest record we have of these reactions is a lamentation by a member of the privileged classes, recounting a peasant rebellion that apparently swept over the Nile Valley at the beginning of ancient Egypt's feudal period. Quote, "Behold the palaces thereof, The walls are dismantled. Behold all the craftsmen, they do no work. The enemies of the land impoverish its crafts. Behold, he who reaped the harvest knows naught of it. He who has not ploughed fills his granaries. Civil war pays no taxes. For what is a treasure without its revenues? Behold, he who has no yoke of oxen is now possessor of a herd, and he who found no plough oxen for himself is now owner of a herd. Behold, he who had no grain is now owner of granaries, and he who used to fetch grain for himself now has it issued from his own granary. End quote. Not only had the cosmos fallen apart, but with it the state. Quote, "The laws of the judgment hall are cast forth. Men walk upon them in the public places. The poor break them open in the midst of the streets. James Breasted, from whom this account is drawn, astutely observes that this despoliation of the records, archives, and written laws was particularly heinous from the orderly Egyptian's point of view. The withdrawing of writings and records from the public offices for purposes of evidence or consultation was carefully regulated. In this sacrilegious act of destruction, the blood oath took its revenge on written legal ties, parity on status sanctified by codes, usufruct on the titles that confer ownership of property, and the irreducible minimum on the accounts of taxes and grain deliveries to the state, nobility, and priesthood. Thereafter, almost every peasant war was marked not only by the redistribution of property, but also by the burning of archives. The impulse for such actions came from the revolutionary impulse, not from the memory of previous revolts, whose history had been largely suppressed. In that distant period, related by the Egyptian scribe, the memory of tribal life may still have permeated the reality of civilization, and the word, with its moral, legal, and mystical nuances, had not completely replaced the deed. Contract and moral precept still floated on the primordial quicksand that required many centuries of civilization before it could fully harden into class rule and become solidly internalized as guilt, renunciation, and the fear of the chaotic impulses that raged in the unconscious of the oppressed. The memory of later uprisings, which are probably very similar in nature to the one we have already explored, was so completely appropriated by the ruling classes that the historical record is sketchy at best and venal in the accounts it does contain. We know that about the same time the ancient Egyptian peasantry rose against the entrenched class system of the Old Kingdom, or possibly the nobility of the Middle Kingdom. A similar uprising occurred in the Sumerian city of Lagash, for which Kramer, puzzled by the literal meaning of the word amagi, provides a fairly complete account. Judging from Athenian references, Sparta's serf-like helots revolted with disconcerting frequency. So troubling was this history of underclass unrest that even the fairly benign Athenian polis lived in uncertainty about its own slave population. Rome particularly toward the end of its Republican era, was apparently destabilized by a series of slave and gladiatorial revolts, among which Spartacus's historic rebellion, 738 BC, was apparently the most far-reaching and dramatic. This army of slaves and gladiators, later joined by impoverished free people, engaged in a series of major looting expeditions that swept over the Campania and southern Italy until it was crushed by Crassus and Pompey. However, Greece and Rome's class conflicts were largely confined to disputes between commoners and nobles over demands for a fair redistribution of the land, the cancellation of mortgages, and greater juridical equality within the prevailing system of ownership and political authority. Quasi-nationalist uprisings afflicted both city-states after they were drawn into the pursuit of imperial ends, but these conflicts rarely involved deep-seated internal social changes, either at home or abroad.